The committee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time, and all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. The hearing is entitled Examining the SEC's Agenda, Operations, and Budget. I now recognize myself for 3.5 minutes to give an opening statement. This morning, the committee will come to order, please. This morning, we welcome the Securities and Exchange Commission Chairman, Jay Clayton, for his first appearance before our committee. It's been almost a year since an SEC chair appeared before the committee, and I want to take this time to applaud you, Chairman Clayton, for a number of changes that you have made during your brief tenure. Under the previous administration, the SEC failed to develop a capital formation agenda and did very little to promote it beyond what Congress required in the Jobs Act. This committee is extremely encouraged by the SEC's renewed commitment under your leadership to facilitate capital formation to help small businesses access the capital they need to innovate, grow, and provide economic opportunities for all Americans. We also appreciate the public comments you have made on the need to reverse the trend of declining initial public offerings, and the SEC's announcement that confidential IPO filings would be open to all companies, a provision that the House passed as part of the Financial Choice Act. The SEC should also continue to explore ways to simplify its disclosure regime and return to the concept of materiality. The securities laws are not the appropriate avenue to pursue ideological and political agendas that have nothing to do with the SEC's mission and can only harm economic opportunity and growth. Under the previous administration, the SEC dropped the ball on the fiduciary rule and allowed the Department of Labor to insert itself into the SEC's jurisdiction. Surely this must be reversed. And as I continue to watch our national debt clock spinning out of control, it is with deep gratitude that at least I think for the first time since I have served on this committee, and after the SEC's budget has seen an increase of more than 325% since the year 2000, the SEC did not seek a budget increase for FY 2018. Congratulations, it is a welcome change for hardworking taxpayers. I do understand the SEC will request more funding in cybersecurity for FY 2019 for obvious reasons, and this brings me to my next point. The committee has serious questions regarding cybersecurity controls at the SEC. The recent announcement that the SEC's electronic data gathering analysis and retrieval system, known as EDGAR, had not only been hacked in 2016, but that non-public information may also have been used to facilitate illicit trading. This is very, very troubling. Even more troubling is that Congress and the public were not informed until September of 2017. Chairman Clayton, we know that this breach did not happen on your watch, but you are the one who has to fix it. Given the recent Equifax breach and this breach, the committee has serious concerns with the rapidly approaching November 15th implementation for the Consolidated Audit Trail. While the Consolidated Audit Trail serving as a central repository for order and trading activity data, I urge the SEC again to delay its implementation date until the Commission can ensure that the appropriate safeguards and internal controls are in place to protect this data. To echo what your colleague, Commissioner Piawar, said, the SEC has only one chance to get this right. Please make sure you do, sir. I now yield 3 minutes to the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Maloney, ranking member of our Capital Markets Subcommittee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome Chairman Clayton, who is from the great city of New York. One of our country's greatest assets is our economic strength, including our strong capital markets. Investors from all around the world pour their money into the U.S. markets because they trust that our companies are accurately reporting and are accurately auditing their financial statements and that their rights as investors will be protected. And it's this confidence in our markets that we need to focus on maintaining. It is the SEC's job to oversee our markets, which makes the SEC one of the most important regulators in the world. Because of the breadth of activities that it regulates, the SEC must constantly evolve and adapt its regulations in order to respond to new innovations and trends in the market. Sometimes this means modernizing a regulatory regime to take account of new risks that are in the market. Other times it means modernizing the SEC's own operations to account for new risks that the regulator itself faces. The SEC's ability to adapt on both fronts has been highlighted by the recent cyber attacks, both at private companies like Equifax and at the SEC itself with the Edgar attack. While I'm deeply concerned about the Edgar attack, I have noticed that there has been transparency in response to the breach. This breach did not happen on Chairman Clayton's watch, but he has been proactive. Some say not as proactive as he should be, but he has been proactive in disclosing it to the public and ordering a full investigation into the breach. The Edgar system plays a central role in our capital markets. It is the main system where companies keep their investors informed about what is going on in the company. So if there is a problem with Edgar and its reliability is called into question, we need to know about it as soon as possible, and it needs to be fixed immediately. I look forward to hearing from Chairman Clayton as well as other priorities he may have in addition to Edgar. Thank you.
Gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Huizinga, the chairman of the Capital Markets Subcommittee, for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Chairman Clayton. I'll try not to echo our chairman, Hensarling, too much here, but obviously we all know that to protect investors, maintain fair, orderly, and efficient markets, and to facilitate capital formation is the three-part mission of the Securities and Exchange Commission. And as he pointed out, the last administration was more focused on CEO pay ratios and conflict minerals and a number of other things that literally brought nothing to the table. This designated mission may be important, and as Mary Jo White had said, important, but not the focus of the SEC. Something we've discussed as one of my biggest concerns is the decline in IPOs, those initial public offerings that really have given fewer investment opportunities for Main Street investors. We have the strongest, deepest, most liquid markets here, but we're becoming less and less attractive to growing businesses due to one-size-fits-all kind of securities regulations. Hardworking families in West Michigan and throughout the country rely on capital markets to save for everything from college to retirement, and we must work to maintain these efficient capital markets so investors have the opportunity to receive the greatest return on their investment. We need to ensure that Mr. and Mrs. 401k, as you call our Main Street investors, are able to invest in a better future. Chairman Clayton, I was encouraged by your remarks in July at the Economic Club of New York, where you stressed that a key part of your agenda is facilitating capital formation. I applaud you for that. Well, let's work together, sir, to reverse the negative trend of declining IPOs and instead refocus the SEC on capital formation to expand opportunities for investors, unleash the American spirit, and grow our economy and increase our job creation. So with that, I yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Michigan, the vice-ranking member, Mr. Kildee, for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Chairman Clayton. First, I want to express my concern over potential insider trading by Equifax executives. It is critical that the SEC closely examine these trades to determine, both for itself and the public at large, whether the individuals were taking advantage of knowledge that would not be publicly disclosed for another 6 weeks. I also urge the SEC to clarify to companies when a cybersecurity breach is material that it must be disclosed. 6 weeks between discovery and disclosure is simply too long, especially considering the scale of the Equifax breach. The SEC plays a critical role in ensuring the safety and soundness of our financial markets, and it's vital that it fully examine the Equifax breach in order to begin restoring confidence in our markets. Second, I am interested in your plans regarding disclosure of political contributions by publicly traded companies. I disagreed with your predecessor, Chair White, in her decision not to undertake rulemaking on this issue. The Supreme Court's 2010 decision in Citizens United v. SEC or FEC opened the floodgates in terms of political spending. And while we now have seen money take an even more outsized role in our democracy, it's all more to participate in the democratic process. It will take transparency to restore confidence in our election process, and I urge the SEC to do its part and undertake rulemaking. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Time of the gentleman has expired. Today we welcome the testimony of the Honorable Jay Clayton. This is the first time that Chairman Clayton has appeared before our committee. Chairman Clayton was sworn in as chairman of the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission on May 4th of this year. Chairman Clayton earned a B.S. in engineering from the University of Pennsylvania, a B.A. and M.A. in economics from the University of Cambridge, and a J.D. from the University of Pennsylvania Law School. Prior to joining the commission, Mr. Clayton was a partner at Sullivan and Cromwell. Without objection, the witness's written statement will be made part of the record. Chairman Clayton, you are now recognized to give an oral presentation of your testimony. Thank you.
Chairman Hensarling, Congresswoman Maloney, Congressman Huizenga, Congressman Kildee, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today about the work of the SEC. I will start with a second thank you. This one to my fellow commissioners and the 4,600 women and men of the SEC who have been incredibly welcoming to me. I have benefited from my interaction with these individuals. During my 5 months at the commission, I've devoted a substantial portion of my efforts to agency operations. As discussed in more detail in my written testimony, I believe there are 4 areas where additional focus and resources are most needed. 1, cybersecurity. 2, retail investor protection. 3, market integrity, including structure, risk, and resiliency. And 4, capital formation. My written testimony also discusses in detail the work of the Commission over the past 5 months and various policy initiatives moving forward. The remainder of my oral testimony will focus on cybersecurity, and I will end with one comment on our regulatory agenda. I've been concerned by and focused on cybersecurity both internally and externally since my first weeks at the Commission. As recent events demonstrate all too well, this is an area where we need to devote significant additional resources and attention. I will turn to the recently disclosed incident from 2016. In August 2017, I was notified of a possible intrusion into our EDGAR system. In response to this information, I immediately commenced an internal review, which led me to understand that the breach of our EDGAR system in 2016 provided access to non-public information, and that the information obtained by the intruders may have been used for illicit trading. This matter involving our EDGAR system and its ramifications concern me deeply. I am focused on getting to the bottom of the matter and, importantly, lifting our general cybersecurity efforts moving forward. I recognize that I am not the only one who is deeply concerned. Rightfully, the 2016 intrusion will cause this committee and others to increase their focus on whether the Commission's approach to cybersecurity appropriately addresses our risk profile. This is all the more reason it was appropriate to disclose the 2016 intrusion to Congress and the American people 2 weeks ago and to update that disclosure this past Monday. These disclosures were appropriate and important, even though our review and investigation are ongoing and may take substantial time to complete. On Monday, I disclosed that pursuant to our ongoing investigation, the staff had determined that the EDGAR test filings accessed by third parties contained personal information of 2 individuals. Staff are reaching out to the 2 individuals to notify them and to offer identity theft protection and monitoring services. I also noted in the release that should the agency's review uncover additional such individuals, whose sensitive information may have been accessed, the staff will contact them and offer identity protection and monitoring as well. With respect to 1, getting to the bottom of what happened in 2016, 2, assessing where we are today, and 3, improving our approach to cybersecurity moving forward, I have organized the agency's efforts into 5 work streams. The independent review of the 2016 intrusion by our Office of Inspector General. Second, the investigation led by the Division of Enforcement into the potential illicit trading, getting to who the hackers were. A focused review and, as necessary or appropriate, uplift of our EDGAR system. 4, the more general assessment and uplift of the agency's cybersecurity risk profile efforts that were initiated shortly after my arrival, including the identification and review of systems, current and planned, that hold market-sensitive data or personally identifiable information, including the Consolidated Audit Trail, or CAT. And finally, the agency's own internal review of the EDGAR intrusion. While there are limits on what I know and can discuss about the 2016 incident due to the status and nature of these reviews and investigations, I believe this is an appropriate framework to approach the key questions of what happened in the past, where we stand, and how we can improve moving forward. As a result of this incident, some have questioned whether we can appropriately protect sensitive information we receive and whether we should receive additional data to further our mission. I want to say that we are serious about this, but it's not the time for us to pull back from important market oversight initiatives. Our mission is too important to millions of Main Street investors, issuers, and market participants to do so. In short, we must be vigilant and we must do better. Turning to policy matters, my written testimony discusses our recent regulatory efforts and objectives in detail, including my philosophy on our upcoming Regulatory Flexibility Act agenda. I am pleased that this morning, the Commission announced it will hold an open meeting next Wednesday to consider a rule proposal by the FAST Act to modernize and simplify the disclosure requirements in Regulation SK in a manner that reduces costs and burdens on companies with no reduction in the disclosure of all required material information. I know that a bipartisan group of members of this committee worked to include this provision in the FAST Act. I thank you for your efforts. In closing, I'd like to thank the committee for its continued support of the SEC, its mission, and its people, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Chair now recognizes himself for 5 minutes. So, Chairman Clayton, I'm happy to hear the FAST Act announcement. I will have a couple of cybersecurity questions, time permitting, but I really want to lead off with your concern about the declining IPO markets. And so, in your opinion, what are some of the chilling effects of regulation on the IPO market? What would you focus this committee's attention on, and why is it so important that we reinvigorate the IPO market?
Let me start with your last question, why I think this is so important, which is the choices available to our retail investors, the people who are saving for their retirement, I believe are in fact diminishing because the number of public companies is diminishing. The most efficient way for retail investors to invest is in our public capital markets. It is costly for them to invest in private investments. So I want to increase, to the extent possible, the opportunity set for our Main Street investors to invest in the growth of America. That's important. In terms of why do we have fewer public companies today than we did, at different periods in the past, and why is the trend going in a downward direction? There are a couple of things. One is we do have a bit of a one-size-fits-all model, and that is that the regulatory regime that applies to a very, very large company is essentially the same as applies to a medium-sized or smaller public company. I question whether that continues to be appropriate. I think that the Jobs Act and Emerging Growth Companies demonstrates that a scaled system that is rooted in investor protection, audited financial statements, disclosure of material information is something we should be looking at. I also recognize that there are alternative forms of capital available today that were not available 20, 25 years ago, including a fairly robust private equity and venture capital market. But I'm looking at that landscape, and I'd like to see a greater proportion of companies end up in the public market so that all investors had an opportunity to participate in America's growth.
So switching gears, the consolidated audit trail is due to go live in just a little bit more than a month. So given the Edgar breach, how can you assure this committee that that CAT is ready for prime time? Have all cybersecurity concerns been ameliorated?
Chairman, the CAT is being developed by the SROs, the self-regulatory organizations, FINRA, and the exchanges, with a contractor. I look at us as having two roles, the SEC. We have an oversight role in that we oversee those entities, and we are also a beneficiary of the CAT once it's up and running and that we get the data. With respect to your question about cybersecurity and the SEC, from the time I got to the Commission and got briefed on the CAT, the questions I've been asking are, what information are we taking in that's sensitive? Do we need it to fulfill our mission, and can we protect it? And I've made it clear that I don't want information unless we need it for our mission.
But Mr. Chairman, have those questions been answered to your satisfaction?
To my satisfaction, from the Commission's perspective, the answer has not yet been answered to my satisfaction.
And will this go live until those questions are answered to your satisfaction?
I want to be clear, but it's a little bit complicated. As far as us taking the information, we're not going to take it until those questions with respect to the SEC are answered to my satisfaction. I also have questions about the SROs and the CAT generally in our oversight role. There's a contractual relationship among those parties. I'm in dialogue with them, but I want to be satisfied that they're doing what they're supposed to do as well.
Switching gears again, the Financial Choice Act, which the House has passed, contains a number of capital formation provisions, including creating venture exchanges, modernizing the definition of accredited investor. What are some of the actions that the SEC is pursuing to make it, again, going public easier and make it more attractive to small businesses and entrepreneurs?
So, answer to both questions. There is the private investing market, which retail investors and sophisticated investors do participate in. I've asked the Division of Corporation Finance to look across the way we approach that, crowdfunding, Reg A, Reg D, and say, is there a consistency that we can bring to this? Removing complexity while maintaining the same investor protection has to benefit those small and medium-sized businesses. That's the bottom line.
My time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Maloney, ranking member of our Capital Markets Subcommittee.
Chairman Clayton, I think the Edgar hack has demonstrated that government agencies and the SEC in particular are constantly under attack from hackers and criminals. So the SEC really needs to step up its cyber defenses in the wake of this attack. So what are you doing to ensure that the SEC has the most robust cyber defenses possible? Are you creating any new positions, any new policies, any new procedures, any new resources? What are you doing to help protect the agency from the risk of cyber attack?
Let me say what we're not doing. We're not waiting till the end of the 5 work streams that I outlined to take action. We're doing the immediate attention on the Edgar uplift. But with regard more generally to your question, I want to say that I have the support of both Commissioner Piwar and Commissioner Stein. We're looking at our incident response plan to see if we can improve it. With respect to new positions, this is something that I'm pleased to say I have the support. I'm ready to move forward and say it today. I think the agency could use a chief risk officer, now, not just for cybersecurity, but for general risk. But I've begun the search for a chief risk officer for the agency.
Thank you. I want to talk to you about the gap between the company when companies determine that there's been a material change that they need to disclose to the public and when they actually disclose it to the public. And as you know, the current SEC rules give companies 4 days to disclose material changes, and there's been research from Professor Robert Jackson in New York, Columbia Law School, that shows that executives do actually trade profitably in this 4-day gap. Senator Van Hollen and I have been working on a bill, which we sent a draft to your office, that would prohibit executives from trading in this 4-day gap. And do you think this makes sense? What is your response? Should executives be allowed to trade after they've learned about a material change, but before they actually disclose it to the public?
Thank you. As I mentioned to Senator Van Hollen, and as I mentioned to you, I believe it's good corporate hygiene that once a determination has been made that there's a material event to disclose, that the company's insider trading policy, which is, essentially when are you and are you not allowed to trade, would have a control in there where the senior executives would not be allowed to trade. So as I said before, and I agree with you, I like this concept.
Okay, thank you. I understand that you're examining a pilot program on the access fees charged by exchanges. Many market participants have told me that this pilot program really needs a bucket with 0 rebates in order to accurately test the effectiveness of different access fee levels. So my question is, are you going to include a 0 rebate bucket in the access fee pilot program?
So we have an access fee pilot under consideration. And this question as to what tiers would you have in a pilot program has been on my mind, and I know it's been on the other commissioners' minds, essentially to get the right data so that when we do the pilot, we have the data we need to assess whether the maker-taker model is working appropriately, et cetera. That's a prelude to the answer to your question, which is there's been nothing definitive decided, but a 0 rebate or 0 fee bucket is something that's under consideration and I've discussed with the staff.
And lastly, you mentioned in your testimony that you're limited in what you can say about the Edgar hack due to the IG investigation, but you disclosed it as soon as you found out about it. Now, if only you or the other SEC commissioners had been informed of the Edgar attack earlier, we might have learned about this much sooner. So my question is, what is the SEC's policy on notifying the commissioners about cyber incidents? When the Office of Information Technology detects any sort of unauthorized intrusion into the SEC systems, are they supposed to notify their superiors, in this case the SEC's Chief Operating Officer, or is notification only required for really serious hacks? What is the SEC's policy in this disclosure practice?
Looking at our past incident response plan is something that we'll do as part of the review. But your question is a good one. Let me put it in a little bit of context. As I've said before, we're constantly under attack. Many government agencies are constantly under attack. I can't be notified of every attempt, but there does have to be a mechanism for assessing the significance, not materiality, but the significance of the attack and elevating it to me and the other commissioners.
Time of the gentlelady has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Huizenga, chairman of our Capital Markets Subcommittee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to be moving fast. We only have 5 minutes. The chairman had touched on the Consolidated Audit Trail, the CAT. I have very serious concerns as well. That was part of a letter that we had sent to you last week. I am a little curious based on the answers that we have. It seems like it might be a chicken or the egg situation here. Whether you're waiting for the SROs to declare that the system isn't ready, and the SROs are waiting for SEC to say, hey, wait a minute, we're not ready to take this because of whether it's breach in Edgar or other things. So I don't know if I'll give you very briefly if you want to clarify that at all, or we can just leave it fogged up.
I think they have an obligation to get the CAT system up and running, including an obligation for cybersecurity. With respect to me taking the data, once they have it, I'm not going to take it until I'm comfortable.
So you're waiting to hear whether they can or can't provide you the data in a safe, secure manner.
Yeah, they're
okay, they'll be thrilled to hear that, I'm sure.
This isn't
all right. There's going to be a
place to negotiate with them.
Yeah. Okay. There's. I won't try to get in the middle of that, but we do need to address this. You're going to hear a number of others as my concern of Equifax, the breach of Edgar. I do want to offer my philosophical support with my ranking member Maloney on this 4-day executive trading gap question being addressed, and I look forward to seeing some language on that and working with her. I do want to quickly move on to MiFID, the Markets and Financial Instruments Directive 2, MiFID 2, which is a European Union directive. It's going to require banks to unbundle research payments and charge for research separately from brokerage services. The MiFID rules will require investment research to be paid from either a fund manager's own account or from the client research payment account, which would limit these long-recognized use of commissions from trading being used to help pay for research, quote-unquote soft dollars. Well, MiFID II regime directly contradicts the U.S. regime, and under the 1934 Securities Act, brokers are prevented from receiving direct payment for research unless they are registered as an investment advisor, which would subject them to a completely, entirely new regulatory regime. Clearly, I think we would agree that that would disrupt current models. September 14 of 2017, the world's largest fund manager, BlackRock, announced that it will pay for external research out of its own pocket, following similar announcements from Vanguard, the world's second largest fund manager, and JP Morgan Asset Management. Many of the asset management industry fear these moves in response to MiFID II are really changing the way the industry does business. And a number of folks up in New York, my friend Kenny, he knows who he is, have expressed grave concern about this, but I'm not sure anybody knows really what to do with this. There have been numerous calls on the SEC to provide some exemptive relief or negotiate with the EU to find a workable solution. Does the SEC intend to provide any formal relief or guidance for U.S. firms to comply with the conflicts between MiFID II and the U.S. regime?
The answer is yes, we are trying to do this. The European Union has decided they want to proceed in a fairly specific way, separating payments of research and commissions, which is, as you correctly outlined, different from the way our markets are structured and have been, and we've approached it for a while. In a nutshell, our aim is to, allow them to do that in their market, but not either directly or indirectly force the importation of that system. If our broker-dealers and other market participants want to take a different approach from the past, they're free to do so, but we want to provide a structure that allows the current model to continue. We can then assess, as things go on, what the best way forward is.
Okay, well, as we all know, that time is flying by. In our remaining few seconds here, market structure, equity market structure. We've started a series of hearings on capital markets subcommittee, and really trying to look at the 1975 amendments to the Securities and Exchange Act, a number of things, Reg NMS and others. Do you believe that it's important that both we and you at the SEC perform a holistic review of equity market structure, and should the focus be on regulation NMS, or should it be a much broader review?
Yes, I believe it's important. I think a focus on Reg NMS principally makes sense, but you have to ask yourself the broader question. Are we driving efficiency in our markets, and do we have sufficient liquidity, and are the people who are providing that liquidity being appropriately compensated, undercompensated, overcompensated? Is it real liquidity? Those are the kind of broad questions we ought to be asking.
All right, I appreciate that. My time has expired.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Velasquez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Mr. Clayton. Chairman Clayton, in the Jobs Act, we increased the investor threshold for registering as a public reporting company from 500 to 2,000 investors with no more than 500 non-accredited investors. In implementing the rules relating to these increased thresholds, the SEC changed the definition of accredited investor as it is applied to those thresholds, requiring firms to have a reasonable belief as to each investor's accredited investor status annually, rather than only at the time of the initial investment. Some firms have interpreted this as a requirement by the Commission that firms annually ask their investors to recertify that they remain accredited investors. Among other things, this change leaves any firm taking advantage of the Jobs Act threshold with great uncertainty as to whether that firm will remain private in the future, undermining the intent of the Jobs Act. Can you please explain how this additional requirement benefits investors, if it at all benefits them?
Well, I think your question is a good one. Again, not every rule that we make is a perfect rule. This is a rule that we have to look at whether it had a good intent, which was, hey, let's just make sure that our status is where it should be. May have had an effect saying, you know what, we're not even going to go there because it's too much trouble. So this is a rule that we should look at.
So my next question is, can this requirement be changed at the Commission, or do you believe this change requires a legislative fix?
Let me answer it this way. I think we should look at it. If we think it should be changed and we can't change it, we'll come back to you and ask for help.
Good. Thank you. Chairman Clayton, more of America's small businesses are accessing capital from financial technology or fintech companies. Some commentators have suggested that the current online marketplace for small business loans falls between the cracks for federal regulators, including the SEC. What do you see as the SEC's role in regulating this space?
So I'm going to give you a general answer about fintech and developments, and then I'll try and specifically answer your question about loans and my interaction with the banking regulators. And I like innovation in the marketplace. I like what we're seeing with distributed ledger technology. I like these things. But as we've seen, including with a enforcement action we brought yesterday, sometimes new things are a new avenue for old frauds. And we're very mindful of that in the initial coin offering space. Now, with respect to the online platforms, you know, I'm not a person who likes to jump on other people's jurisdictions, but I do think that we should be in a dialogue with the banking regulators on this and share with them our thoughts from the security space.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Lukemeyer, chairman of our Financial Institutions Subcommittee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Mr. Clayton. You're a breath of fresh air, trust me. Just a couple, we're discussing this morning the breach, and I would like for you to give me a timeline, if you wouldn't mind. Just take a few moments here so we all know exactly what happened, when it happened, what you knew, when you knew it, if you wouldn't mind just briefly.
I'll do what I can, and I'll give you my timeline, which is in August of this past year, I was notified that there may be a problem with Edgar. I asked, okay, what's the problem? What's the extent of it? Immediately got to the bottom of it. It's not easy to get to the bottom of these things. We're talking about something that was, in 2016. You have to pull the servers, try and, it's been a long time since I've been a computer guy, but, a lot of work through comparing what they looked like at one period to what they looked like another period, trying to find whether the internet. When it became apparent that we had a significant problem, I decided it needed to be disclosed. So we disclosed that, and I will say our work is very much still ongoing as to the extent to which this intrusion took place, the information that was accessed, and then the next step of how was that information possibly used in the marketplace. With respect to 2016, what happened in 2016, I'm gonna wait for more information from our internal investigation about when the intrusion was noticed, how it was patched, and as Congresswoman Maloney and others have said, what was the escalation process and was it followed? Those questions I think I have to wait on.
Okay. In your testimony a while ago, you said that the breach basically had some non-public information that was used for illicit trading or could have been. So to me, that begs the question, are our markets safe? Are they being manipulated? Investors must be able to trust the system before they can, should be willing to participate in it. And this falls right in your bailiwick of the trust of the public with regards to the systems that we have in place. So, number one, I guess, what kind of information was there, and did it affect trading? And what are you doing to look down the road as a result of this breach here to suggest to the different trading platforms how they can protect the data and make sure that those are not implicated or are impacted or are breached themselves?
First, you're absolutely right. This is serious because it does impact the integrity of our markets. This kind of information, non-public information that is stored either at the SEC or other places, is a target of nefarious actors because it's valuable to them because they can trade ahead of the rest of the market. So question one is, do we need it? In this case, we're talking about test filings, and I expect, but I don't know the details, the filings that were probably let me say this, filings that were of value were in advance of earnings releases in all likelihood, or another market event, and that they happen to include information, that's the night before the release, or something like that. But that's the type of question in the overall review that we should be asking ourselves. Do we need that information where there's a latency between the time we get it and the time it becomes public? And if we do need it, then we have to pay particular attention to it.
During the course of the process here, I chair the financial institutions subcommittee here, and our data is right square in the middle of what we're doing. Tomorrow we're going to have Equifax in here. In a couple of weeks, we're going to have another hearing in our committee with regards to data breaches and data security. And some of the things we're looking at is the protocols for notification and new forms of perhaps IDs that people use to be able to access it. I saw in your testimony here you had 50 million times a day the Edgar system is accessed for individuals who do it in a positive way to look at data that's there. We need to let that disclosure information still be available, but how do you protect it? I saw that there's biometric stuff, and I saw this morning where the administration is talking about doing away with Social Security numbers as IDs. Do you have some thoughts on what you would like to suggest to us with regards to identification monikers as well as notification protocols?
Well, let me try and stay in my space. And I have asked the folks at the Commission, if we are taking things like personally identifiable information, Social Security numbers, date of birth, do we really need to be taking that? And if we do need to be taking it, should we be taking it in a different or disaggregated form from the other market information we're taking? I mean, those kind of threshold questions are ones we should be asking.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The chair now recognizes the ranking member, the gentlelady from California, Ms. Waters.
Thank you very much, Chairman J. Clayton. Chairman Henslin, thank you for holding this hearing. And I'd like to thank Vice Ranking Member Kildee for managing today. Mr. Chairman, 2 weeks ago, you announced that in August 2017, you learned that a 2016 breach of the SEC's electronic system for public company filings, quote, may have provided the basis for illicit gain through trading, end quote. This announcement came right on the heels of Equifax announcement of a data breach that exposed the sensitive personal information of 145 million American consumers. These incidents are deeply disturbing as they indicate critical vulnerabilities in our financial systems. The dangers presented by these vulnerabilities are even more potent, given the recent efforts by foreign actors to destabilize the United States through cyber attacks on Wall Street, U.S.-based information technology companies, and even our national election processes. Could you tell us whether the SEC's investigation, as far as you know, has uncovered the involvement of any foreign actors in the 2016 hack? To what extent are you coordinating with the Department of Homeland Security to identify and guard against significant cyber threats from state and non-state actors?
Thank you. I agree with you about the seriousness of this issue that we had, the Equifax issue, and issues generally. To the extent, with respect to the investigation of, I'll call it our incident, and the hackers, perpetrators, I don't want to comment with any specificity because there is an ongoing investigation, and I've been advised, and I agree with this advice, that getting into details may hamper that investigation. But we are looking at who the actors are, trying to identify it, trying to identify how long they were there, and with the ultimate goal of bringing them to justice.
So given all of this, the GAO identified 26 deficiencies in the SEC's control over its key financial systems and information, including failure to properly prevent unauthorized access to sensitive financial data. What steps has the SEC taken to address the deficiencies identified in the GAO's report and better protect non-public market information from exploitation by cyber criminals?
We've had two recent GAO audits, which I think you referenced there. My understanding of where we stand on those is that there were 15 recommendations, and we've implemented 12 in one report. I can get you more details, but I think adding it up, of the 26, I think we've implemented over 20. At this stage. Still needs to go through the process with the GAO for the GAO to be satisfied that our implementation is what they would expect.
Do you feel you have the resources available to you to make these corrections? The SEC has been underfunded, seriously underfunded, and many of us have fought very hard to try and give you, our cop on the block, the resources that you need to do the work that you have to do to protect our investors, et cetera. Do you feel you have the resources necessary to correct these financial systems that the GAO have identified need so much work?
So I've made an assessment now in the first 5 months that I've been there, and for fiscal year 19, we were flat this year. I think that was appropriate given that I'm new. But going forward, I'm asking for a 7% increase, a substantial portion of that going to cybersecurity. I would say the next thing behind cybersecurity is market integrity, making sure, and those two are related, market integrity. And then I'd like to put more money, I'd like to put more money into retail fraud. But the short answer to your question is we need more money for cybersecurity.
All right, so you're talking about flat funding for 2018?
Yeah, that was what we had for 2018.
Well, with flat funding, how are you going to be able to move forward to do what needs to be done to ensure that you can protect all of this vital information that's exposed? That's
a really good question, a question I asked myself. I had what I will say is a pool of reserve, 20 positions, new positions, and a bit of money for contingencies. Well, I now know what those contingencies are.
Okay, so
authorize the hiring of 6 additional people for cybersecurity and putting some additional money into it.
So you have a reserve that you'll be using probably for 18, given the flat funding?
I'm using what, I use a non-technical term. I'm using what wiggle room I had for cybersecurity.
I'm trying to get you to
the
say what you need so the chairman will hear you.
time of the gentlelady has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Duffy, chairman of our Housing and Insurance Subcommittee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Clayton, welcome to the committee. I wanted to get some clarification on the Edgar hack. This took place some point in 2016, is that fair to say?
Yes, that is.
And Homeland Security was notified of this in 2016, is that right?
I believe that to be correct, yes.
And do you know if any of the commissioners or Chair White were notified at the same time that Homeland Security was notified?
I have no indication that they were notified.
So we have a hack. Someone at the SEC knows that it's taking place. They notify Homeland Security, but don't notify the chair or the commissioners. Does that give you some pause?
That is a question that should be answered as part of our investigation, yes.
Better yet, when did you become the chair of the SEC?
May of this past year.
May of this year. And when did you find out about this hack?
In August.
Does that give you some pause?
Yes.
There's some conversation about a deep state that the chair, the head of the organization, on day one wouldn't have been apprised of this is concerning to me. And hopefully, I know, listen, you just got there. Hopefully, you will take a look at this in the chain of command and ask the questions: who should be making decisions at the SEC? And frankly, I would say it'd be you and the commissioners, not the deep state.
Fair
enough.
Fair enough.
Want to quickly move to economic growth. So there's been a lot of conversation about the lackluster economic growth that we've had since the crisis, or over the Obama years, of 1.8%. We just hit 3.1% growth this last quarter. I hear President Trump, our former colleague and committee member Mick Mulvaney, has talked about this frequently. What we can do to put people back to work, what we can do to address our deficit clock if we can actually just grow our economy. And that is wrapped around a conversation of tax reform. We hear a lot of conversation about regulatory reform in government. What space does the SEC have in helping grow the American economy, address our debt, put people back to work? Do you have any space to play in economic growth?
I think well, let me say this. I share the view, your view, I think it's the view of most people in this room, that the difference between 3.5% growth and 2.5% growth is huge over any meaningful period of time. As a citizen, growth in jobs, what I want to see. So definitely bring that perspective to the SEC in terms of growth in jobs. Capital formation is essential to it, and as is confidence in our markets. So I am looking, and the men and women of the SEC are looking, how can we facilitate, how can we break down barriers to capital formation without in any way affecting the integrity of our markets? And that is, I know it's front of mind for our Division of Corporation Finance. It's front of my mind, and we're gonna continue to look for opportunities.
And for my constituents in central and northern Wisconsin, your work on improving capital formation, that has an impact on jobs, doesn't it? That has an impact on economic growth. Is that fair to say?
It is fair to say.
Okay, I want to quickly pivot to corporate governance. We've been spending some time looking at proxy advisory firms. We basically have two that own the market. There's a lack of transparency. There's a lack of competition. I'm wondering if this is a space that you've had an opportunity to look at, and whether you see whether there is a need for at least some reform in this space.
It is a space that I've had an opportunity to look at. It's a space that the Commission is looking at. These firms provide a service that has value. They amalgamate data so that 1,000 investment managers don't have to do it and provide that data.
Can I just ask, is that a service to the company that hires them, or is this a service to the ideology of the firm that owns them?
Good question. Good question. Because they are the aggregator of data and the entities that people look to for that data, they have significant influence in the way they present that data. That's just the way life works. I'm aware of that. I'm looking at it, and I think it's something that we should all look at, because particularly with the increase in indexing and passive money, that
if I could just make
further increases their influence.
My time is almost up, but when we hear stories about a firm getting a negative recommendation, and right on the heels of that coming out, lo and behold, an offer comes to buy the consulting services of the firm that just gave you a negative recommendation, and they claim there's a firewall between the two. But I watch enough mafia movies where people come in and go, yeah, we're going to protect you. I mean, you pay up. I mean, this is a space that is ripe for the SEC to look at, in this committee as well. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Scott.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Chairman Clayton. Last week, I sent you a letter regarding legislation that I'm helping to lead, which is H.R. 355. I hope you got the letter. It's entitled the Exchange Regulatory Improvement Act. And it's by my colleague, Republican colleague from Georgia, Mr. Loudermilk, and myself. Now, our bill simply clarifies the definition of the word facility of an exchange so that companies like the New York Stock Exchange are not hamstrung when trying to diversify the lines of business that they provide to their members and to investors. I want to make it clear also that our bill in no way limits the Securities and Exchange Commission's regulatory powers, nor does it impede their ability to do their job. But our bill does not carve anything out from the Securities and Exchange's regulatory jurisdiction. The SEC has full authority today and tomorrow, should our bill become law, to continue to go after the bad actors and to oversee the filings of market data, co-location, listing standards, and other business changes filed with the SEC today. All we're trying to do is to allow the necessary breathing room for the New York Stock Exchange and companies like that to be able to operate in a more fluid situation. Your thoughts on that? Were you able to get my letter and read it?
I am aware of your letter, and I'm aware of the issue, which is in our regulatory approach to the New York Stock Exchange or similar facilities, are we, the SEC, going beyond our bread and butter and getting into regulating businesses that are away from or tangential to the operations of those facilities? And it's a good question. It's a good question. You know, we shouldn't be stretching in a way that impedes innovation. Right. So we should be asking ourselves that question.
Right. Well, we look forward to working with you and sharing your input as we move this legislation forward by Mr. Loudermilk and myself. Now I want to go to another bill. Ms. Gwen Moore and myself are working on a bipartisan bill with Republican Keith Rothfuss entitled or numbered House Resolution 2319. And it addresses a concern that we have that your rule that went into effect a year ago, it was the amendment to the rule governing money market funds. Now, as you know, Chairman, Rule 2A7 of the Investment Company Act requires certain funds available to institutional investors to switch from a usable, very usable net asset value, which we call NAV, to allow it to fluctuate or float, but others don't get that benefit. And I know the SEC went through a very rigorous rulemaking process on this rule, but sometimes very few times, but sometimes, our regulators get it wrong. And I think this is an example of that. Now, your predecessor, chairman of the SEC, argued that the benefits of a floating NAV would exceed the costs and issuers of commercial paper and municipal debt. But evidence is showing that this isn't the case, because since the SEC has finalized the rule in 2015, we've seen a massive flight from prime and tax-exempt money funds because the costs of a floating NAV are so high. So we have this bipartisan effort, and what are your thoughts on that?
I am aware of the shift in assets from municipal and commercial assets to government assets in the institutional money market space as a result of our rule. It was anticipated. There are other considerations here, but I am looking at it.
Good.
Our Department of Economic Research is looking at it. And so I think it's too early to say we're wrong.
Right.
Too early to say we were 100% right.
Time of the gentleman.
Welcome your thoughts.
Time of the gentleman has expired. Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Missouri, Ms. Wagner, chairman of our Oversight and Investigations Subcommittee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Chairman Clayton. Before I get into my line of questioning, I did want to mention the latest news concerning the hack on the Edgar corporate filing system. As chairman of the Oversight and Investigations Committee, I'd ask that you continue to communicate with our staff concerning this issue, as it is of obviously great interest to all of us, and I thank you for the time you've spent with them at this point. Now, as you know, I've spent the better part of the last 4 years fighting for low and middle income investors who are losing their access to investment advice under the Department of Labor's misguided fiduciary rule. A recent U.S. Chamber of Commerce survey noted 13.4 million consumer accounts will lose access to products under the Department of Labor rule. America is in the midst of a savings crisis, and we want to make things easier, not harder for them. Just last week, I introduced the Protecting Advice for Small Savers Act, the PASS Act of 2017, which will create a standard for broker-dealers that will eliminate, I hope, any confusion. My bill, among other things, will repeal the Department of Labor rule, create a best interest standard for broker-dealers and all the services they provide, and require them to disclose compensation and any conflict of interest that exists. Most importantly, it will allow these broker-dealers to do what they must do, which is act in the best interest of their clients. Mr. Chairman, I believe the PASS Act of 2017 would certainly provide clarity for the investor. If you are sitting across from a broker-dealer and maybe you have two different accounts with them, it is important that you have the same standard. Unfortunately, that isn't the current practice, and that is causing both confusion and harm. Can you comment, sir, on how important it is to fix this, to move from this bifurcated regulatory regime created under the Department of Labor rule, sir?
Yes. So we've talked about one of the things that I initially focused on in getting into the job, cybersecurity.
Right.
One of the other initial focuses was this. I want to thank Secretary Acosta for reaching out to us and saying, hey, this is something that we should try and work on together. And we have been. And a lot of the themes that you outlined are the themes that I have, which is choice. Investors should have a choice. What type of account they want, what type of relationship
And you stated that the choice is diminishing, in fact, in your earlier testimony.
And an asset choice, what assets they want to invest in. There should be clarity. I recognize that there's not the kind of clarity that there should be in the marketplace today. We should bring clarity. There ought to be consistency with us in the Department of Labor. We can't have asymmetric standards. Can't put one hat on when you're talking about 50% of your assets and another hat on when you're talking about another 50%. It makes no sense. And then we have to cooperate. They have a mandate. We have a mandate. They're not the same, but we can cooperate and get there, I believe. So I'm for all of those things. Now the devil's in the details, and we're working on it.
Do you agree this is something we need to make sure is completely transparent for that investor?
Yes.
Wonderful. In July of this year, the state of Nevada implemented its own fiduciary standard. Are you concerned about the potential impact a patchwork of state laws will have on the provision of retirement advice?
I am.
My staff and I have been reviewing the comments submitted to the SEC as part of the review. There are a lot of very personal stories that concern me, mostly how the rule will result in decreased services. As you know, the Dodd-Frank Act gave the SEC the authority to establish regulations in this space. Can you tell me, Chairman Clayton, what your next step is, and when will the SEC be acting?
The next step in anything like this would be a rule proposal. We're working on such a proposal. We want to work with the Department of Labor. If this were easy, it would already be fixed. We got a lot to do, but I'm confident that we're going to put forward something that addresses those 4 issues and that has a standard that protects investors and that they understand.
We're all interested in a best interest standard. We want to make sure that there is access, that there is choice, and that it is affordable for those low and middle income investors. I have maintained all along the past 5 years, this is about Main Street, not about Wall Street. This is about taking care of those that should be saving for the future in the middle of the savings crisis. So I thank you, Chairman Clayton. I look forward to working with you, and my time has expired.
Time of the gentlelady has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Meeks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Over here. Thank you. Hello, Mr. Chairman.
Hi.
Good to see you. Good to have you here. And I first want to start off by thanking you for replying to a letter that I sent to you earlier on. And I'm sure if you recall my letter dealing with diversity, is very important to me. So let me just, and I assume that we are in the same spot that you do consider that board diversity in regards to gender and ethnicity, et cetera, on our public companies is tremendously important to disclose, and so that the public knows who's on these boards, and it also helps the culture within some of these companies. Are we together on that? Do you think?
We are together on diversity, adding value in decision-making bodies, in organizations. I believe in it, and I think it's important in our public companies. It's important to me at the SEC.
And so the companies should disclose to the degree. I know that the board diversity rule, your predecessor was talking about how we needed to improve it, and that was on the agenda, and that's why I wrote the letter to you, because I was concerned when I heard that you were removing that improvement from the agenda dealing with board diversity. So I'm very concerned about that, because if it's something is not working, I think that we should fix it, correct?
So we have a rule in place that says that to the extent companies have a policy regarding diversity, they are to discuss it and how they approach it. I've asked our Division of Corporation Finance to look at that, to look at the work they've done in the past, and to see if we're getting the type of disclosure that we would expect companies to provide in this area. How do you think about putting together a mix of directors that's going to best serve the shareholders, keeping in mind various characteristics of diversity? And that's...
So disclosing if those boards on these public corporations, then shouldn't they be disclosing the diversity that they have on their boards, whether or not, and what criteria, if any, that they're setting forth for women, for ethnic minorities, for disabled, that's information. I know, for example, it's important to a state like mine, where my comptroller is saying that if you're going to get the pension funds of all of New Yorkers, which are diverse, we want to make sure that those companies have diverse boards, and so therefore there should be, and I thought the diversity rule, that it has to be disclosed, or should be disclosed, the diversity on these boards. And I'll just add, I just saw a report that said that basically big companies say they favor diversity, but they refuse to prove it. In other words, only 40% of the companies are talking about where the diverse is, which tells me that there is a lot of room for improvement. And so I would have to turn to the SEC to see how do we improve the rule on diversity disclosure, since it does not appear to be working currently.
Yeah, and some people say that for improvement we should have a grid that has different categories with respect to diversity, and that should be disclosed in the company's proxy statement, as opposed to the current narrative disclosure of how companies approach it. And is that Mr. Stringer who you're referring to?
Yes.
Yeah. And I'm aware of his shareholder engagement in this area, and I believe in shareholder engagement in areas of this type. I'm not at the point where I think a grid is appropriate. I get concerned about that kind of prescribed disclosure, but I'm monitoring this issue.
So what do you think should be done based upon what we've seen from some reports thus far that does not seem to be working, other than just monitoring, or after you monitor and you confirm what we've seen these reports, then what actively do you think you can do as chair of the SEC to make this rule a stronger rule, or to make sure that it's complied with?
Well, I think exactly what I said. I have the Division of Corporation Finance looking at this, looking at whether companies, when a company gets together, when the nominating committee of a company gets together and says, hey, what should we have on our board? What type of skills, what type of perspectives should we have on our board? I would like to see a discussion of that included a discussion
I don't mean to cut you, I've already got 12 seconds. I just want to say this. I think that when you look at levels of skills, everybody, whether you're a woman, you're going to have level of skills, ethnic minority, you're going to have level of skills. The question is, you could have two people to have same, and if you don't consider diversity at all, you can just have one group, period, and just say that they have the level of skills and you've not considered diversity.
I agree with you. I agree with you.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Barr, chairman of our Monetary Policy and Trade Subcommittee.
Chairman Clayton, welcome to the committee, and thank you for your service. As you know, the SEC has adopted a rule that will require all mutual funds that invest in stocks and bonds to file monthly reports detailing all of the securities in their portfolio. The compliance date for this rule is fast approaching. The fund industry expressed deep concerns during the rulemaking that the SEC was not in a position to assure that the data would be kept secure. And it emphasized that the data in the hands of a hacker could be used to trade in a way that could hurt millions of fund investors. For example, criminals might trade ahead of funds based on what they observe in the data or replicate proprietary portfolio strategies. When the SEC adopted the rule, I'm told it issued a 500-plus page release, and only 2 paragraphs of which mentioned the industry's information security concerns. In short, the SEC said that it's none of your business, we've got it covered. Obviously, that is not, in fact, the case given recent revelations, and of course I'll note that the Edgar hack did not occur on your watch. But my question, Chairman Clayton, is this. Shouldn't the SEC delay this monthly reporting of fund portfolio data until it is far more certain that the SEC will be able to keep it secure?
So that provides an example of the type of question that we are asking, which is, are we taking in data that does indeed have significant market sensitivity? And I'll take what the fund industry is saying at face value there, which is that this data, although it may be a month old, is something that would provide someone who had access to it an advantage. If somebody had a large position that they know they needed to get rid of, we can go into details. That is exactly the type of question we're asking.
Thank you.
Can we protect it? We need to know. And if we can't, do we delay our receipt? Do we have people hold it so if we really need it, we can get access to it? Those are all the kind of questions we should be asking.
Thank you. Thank you for taking that under consideration. And I also would applaud you in your written testimony and your verbal testimony talking about disclosure effectiveness and the need to reduce costs and burdens on companies. And I noted your concern about IPO activity, diminished IPO activity, and why companies are not going public. Let me share with you one example of why that may be the case, and a good example of the need to modernize and simplify disclosure requirements. And the perfect example is Section 1503 of the Dodd-Frank Act, that is the mine safety disclosure requirement. Under 1503 of Dodd-Frank, a publicly traded mine operator is required to report on a quarterly or annual basis various violations alleged by MSHA in citations and orders. When MSHA issues any of these citations or orders, it's important to recognize that the mine operator is required to disclose regardless of whether or not it agrees with MSHA's allegations. In the meantime, the mine operator has the ability to dispute MSHA's findings with informal conferencing with MSHA and formally before the Federal Mine Safety and Health Review Commission. In fact, one coal operator in Kentucky told me that over 30% or over a third of all of these MSHA violations are challenged, and many of them are successfully challenged. And that process takes time. It takes about 4 to 6 months from the date of the citation being issued before it can be assigned to an administrative law judge, and during that process, many citations and orders are modified. But by the time this occurs, a publicly traded mine operator may have already been required to include the citation or order in a quarterly or annual filing. Now, here's the problem. The problem is not only is many times these disclosures not material to the investor, they're affirmatively misleading to the investor because of the timing of when they have to file. So talking to attorneys who practice in this MSHA area and have looked at the statute, they believe that the SEC has regulatory discretion to stay the filing requirements, and I would urge the SEC to take a look at this because, of course, this can significantly undermine the public's confidence and investment in the mining industry. And I would just urge you, as you talk about why companies are not going public, this is Exhibit A. This should be the example of Exhibit A. And I'd ask for your response on whether or not the SEC would be willing to review that.
So it's not an area where I practiced, so I don't have the type of familiarity with it that you referenced. But as a more general matter, I have talked about the aggregate effects of incremental requirements, that each one on its own has a purpose, and you can see why people would ask for it. But overall, it creates quite a burden. And one of the metrics I like to ask people who run public companies is, how many days a quarter do you spend on compliance and reporting? And as a result of our rules and the market's reaction to our rules. And I will tell you what bothers me is that it's a significant multiple of the amount of time private company managers who are good spend.
Thank you. I yield back.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Foster.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Chair Clayton. And I'd like to start out by saying that I, too, represent one of the tragically underrepresented minorities in Congress, that is to say, scientists, and how pleased I am to see an engineer in public service. So thank you for that. Now, Chair Clayton, the SEC has been looking into initial coin offerings, including taking recent action against 2 of them. I've been speaking with various people in the ICO space, and I'm interested in your thoughts on where this is all going and whether the ICOs are more likely to evolve into some sort of innovative tool for capital formation or simply an attempt to circumvent security laws while providing inadequate disclosures. Specifically, some of these ICOs involve purchasing something tangible, like, say, cloud storage, that would not traditionally be treated as a security, but however, the purchaser can then sell it, and there's a secondary market. And so there's undoubtedly a room for speculators to, hope to profit as the value of this token appreciates. And adding to this complexity, very often, sometimes the token holder offers as part of the exchange his or her available computing power as part of the bargain, which would seem to me to mean that the token holder is not relying solely on the efforts of others, which is one of the traditional definitions of securities. So, does the Howley test actually work in this case, and where do you see this going?
So, we have tests that look backwards, because that's what we know, what happened in the past. The way I look at these types of arrangements, where you take someone's money, and instead of handing them a stock certificate, you hand them a piece of computer code, and then you take the money and you invest it in a venture. I don't see that much of a distinction between those two, whether you get a stock certificate or whether you get a piece of computer code. But what I am optimistic about is, we have a settlement and transfer system, and I think one of the things that's very appealing, but also can be an engine for fraud about these initial coin offerings, is the ability to transfer, the ability to trade, is greatly enhanced because you're just exchanging computer code across the spectrum rather than getting a stock certificate, signing it over, things like that. So, that's an answer. The answer to your question is it depends. I want to give people who are investing just like a stock certificate the same protection from those kind of things, but I do want to facilitate a more rapid ability to exchange.
Yeah. Okay. Well, at the point you see legislative clarity needed on this stuff, don't hesitate to contact us because, Congress does not always do well at staying abreast to technological developments as we should. So.
Thank you very much.
Now, you've also expressed concern about the declining fraction of companies that are publicly held, and which is something that concerns me greatly. And I was wondering what fraction of that might simply be due to the fact that we're having wealth pile up at the top in our country, and that wealthy people tend to invest in, private equity, direct investments in companies, whereas retail investors sort of come from the middle class. And so if you made an attempt to separate that, because the narrative that we have that there's something wrong with the public markets might be, a symptom of the larger problem that, the wealthy are just having more.
It's a dynamic system, and I think that there's elements of all of this. One thing that we have in this country, which I don't want to lose, is a broad participation in our capital markets. We're actually we're putting more responsibility on individuals to save for their retirement. The amount of funds in self-directed retirement accounts or quasi-self-directed has tripled in the last 3.5 decades. I want to keep that. So there are lots of drivers. The ones you mentioned too probably are having an effect, but we need to have an efficient way. Given what we've decided to do in terms of retirement savings, we need to have an efficient way for the average American to participate in the marketplace.
Great, thank you. And just the last question, I've been really concerned about these reports of sexual harassment in Silicon Valley. You're seeing really egregious things being done that for sure involve misallocation of the investor's capital for reasons that are not economic. And I was wondering, at what, aside from just the fundamental immorality of this, at what point is the problem of investors being, not treated properly something the SEC might get involved in?
I actually had not thought about us getting involved in that. I'll think
Another
about
thing to think about.
Thank
you.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. McHenry, Vice Chairman of the committee.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Clayton. Thank you for being here. And I actually want to follow up on Mr. Foster's question about initial coin offerings. Your investigative finding from July 25th, I found encouraging that the SEC had a finding in order to establish a rationale for initial coin offerings or ICOs. Can you walk me through your thinking on that finding? Because I know it was a major decision for you to enter into a new space and try to regulate and point to good actors that are in the ICO space.
Sure, and there's a process and a substance element to it. The process element was instead of starting with enforcement actions, we decided to start by level setting with this report and saying, hey, here's how to behave well, and here are some things that trouble us. So that was the intent of that, was to notify people in this space there's a way to do this right, and there are some things that trouble us. And if you do it right, we're all for it, and if you do it wrong, you're gonna have some explaining to do. That's it in a nutshell, how we went about it.
And so, I've been involved in crowdfunding, and it looks to me that ICOs are an avenue that are basically trying to that level set to enable the flow of capital and enable different opportunities via technology. So, what are you doing to continue to help entrepreneurs ensure that they're pursuing ICOs correctly?
Well, that was part of the report, was
the process.
First ask yourself if it's a security. In most cases where you're funding some other, it is. And then go through whether it's crowdfunding procedures, Reg A procedures, whatever exemption works for you, go through that exemption. Or if an exemption doesn't work, you're going to have to consider registration, which is probably not a practical avenue at this moment. I think it does highlight that this area of funding smaller businesses through crowdfunding or other means, technology can really help it. It can help us do our job too.
So do you foresee the need for congressional action to ensure that secondary trading of cryptocurrencies are enabled? Or do you believe you have law on your side to properly do that?
The fair answer is I don't know enough about how they're going to trade yet to know if we can do it with what we have or whether we need your help.
Okay, all right. But it's the first step. I mean, we're only 3 months in for the SEC's finding. So
yeah.
With time, I hope we can get more data on that. So let me shift to a separate issue that I know you care about as much as I do, which is this discussion about the rise of the rest, right? How do you help? What we do know is 80% of startup capital goes to 3 states. There are 47 other states that have great ideas, but the flow of capital is not there. It's not commensurate with the set of ideas and opportunities around there. And I know this is something you care about, as we've discussed. What can we do for medium-sized and small businesses in the rest of the country? And what can we do as policymakers? What can you do at the SEC to make sure that's possible?
Well, I think first recognizing that this is the landscape. I mean, I have to say I was surprised that the 3 states get the lion's share. We had some folks in the other day. We've been talking to people about this, small and medium-sized businesses, not intermediaries, but people who have these businesses. I learned something new, which is the Midwest is the world's 4th or 5th largest economy, depending on how you measure it, but it has very little venture capital. It has lots of great companies, lots of well-educated people, a big economy, but very little venture capital, and that should tell us something. So
that initial finding, now we've got to work through steps in order to enable this, right? So the surprising thing to you was a lack of capital.
Yes. Well, and a lack of that type of capital, the type of expertise in the venture market to put that capital to work, because there must be people who have businesses that are worthy of funding.
My time's expired, but I'd love to follow up with you more on those ways that we can enable policy so that the other 47 states benefit. Yield back.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentle lady from Ohio, Ms. Beatty.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ranking Member, and thank you to our witness today, Mr. Secretary. We've had a lot of questions posed to you about the consolidated audit trail. So I have a question. Is it necessary for the CAT to collect Social Security information of the individuals? And if so, what value of that information is it to the SEC?
Mm-hmm. Your question is a question that I have as well. What value do we get from the PII? Now, I'm sure there is some value. I'll give you an example. If we have an insider trading investigation and we want to be able to say, oh, here's this person, and they know that person, identifying who the people are and where they live and how they might work together is something of value to us. And we've actually made great strides in connecting insider trading rings that you would never know on the face of them through data. That said, when do we need to get it? Mm-hmm. Do we need it all the time? Those are very good questions around things like people's Social Security number.
Okay, we may circle back a little more on that. I ask the following question to every secretary that comes here, your predecessor, because I think when you run an operation as large as your operation, it's important for some of us to focus on the people side of it, as well as the process, the security side. So for me, as you know, in Section 342 of the Dodd-Frank with the OMWI Act, it's very important to me as a female and as a black woman, a small business owner, that we have diversity in our agencies, because I think it makes a difference. So I took the liberty of looking at some statistics that I want to share with you now that you're the chairman of the SEC and you had an agency that has that actual mandate under Dodd-Frank. So when you think about of the 500 companies that make up the Fortune 500, only 4 of them have African-American CEOs. That's less than 1%. So I'm going to ask you on 3 questions, do you think that's problematic? The second one, of the 500 companies that make up the Fortune 500, there are only 32 female CEOs. That's roughly 6%. Do you think that's problematic? Even at your old law firm, Sullivan and Cromwell, of the 174 partners, there were 32 women and only 3 were African American. And I guess my point of this exercise is to make sure that I point out it's not just a problem for you, it's a problem for all of the directors that's important to the constituents that I represent. Because I think, and you mentioned it on page 18 of your testimony, that you had value in having a diverse workforce. So I want to know how you're going to continue that, improve that. So maybe when you come back and your expert team might have some females sitting behind you or people of color.
I do have some behind me.
Let's get them on the front row the next time.
Yeah, we will. I want to thank you for this question. So we have an OMWI report that you know about. I read it in connection with my preparation, and then when I got to the commission, I met with Pam Gibbs right away, who's our chief OMWI officer. And so here's the bottom line on our report. We're doing pretty well across the commission, except in one area, leadership. And so when I talked to Pam, and when I look to fill leadership positions, this has been front of mind, and we've been in a regular dialogue about improving that aspect of diversity at the commission.
Let me just, in my few seconds left, let me thank you for that, because so often, I appreciate your honesty, I appreciate your effort, and you've also met with her more than one time. Oh, and so yeah. I want to say thank you for that, because that's not always the case here. And I appreciate you saying that we don't recognizing that it is important that we have women and minority on the team, but to put them in leadership is important. I even beat up on our chairman. We didn't have a female as a chairwoman of any of our committees, and now we have one. So I'm not asking you anything that I don't ask here. So the next time you come, I'll be looking forward to having females and minorities in leadership, and I yield back.
Time of the gentlelady has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Royce, let's try that again, Chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much, Chairman Clayton. At the outset, in your remarks, Mr. Chairman, let me just say I appreciate your comments that we need to give Mr. and Mrs. 401k access to the capital formation of growing companies. I thought you put that well. The current downward trend, as you explained, for companies has fewer and fewer going public, and that has the potential to benefit the few over the many. I strongly share your sentiment that all investors should have the opportunity to participate in America's growth, and I think we stand ready to help you achieve that goal. I think when we talk about the massive Equifax breach, and the attack on the SEC itself. This is not the first, nor will it be the last attack, but consumers as well as investors deserve to know when cyber attacks put their money at real risk. And in your recent speech that you gave before the Economic Club of New York, you emphasized that disclosure requirements extend to cybersecurity issues. Your words were, public companies have a clear obligation to disclose material information about cyber risks and about cyber events, and that you expect them to take this requirement seriously. So I would ask, are there plans for the SEC to look at current disclosure requirements for cybersecurity risks, or do you believe the materiality standard that we currently have is sufficient? What's your view on that?
So thank you for recognizing, there are different constituencies that need to know, consumers and investors, and those two aren't separate, but that's a good way to look at it. In terms of what's my view on this, for me, materiality is the touchstone. I have seen overly prescriptive rules not have the effect that they should. But in this area, though, I think it's pretty clear that your cyber risk profile, hey, where do I have sensitive material? Where would a denial of service attack affect my company? Where would it affect consumers? That's a materiality judgment that I think is fairly easy to make, and I expect companies to be thinking about it in the same way they think about other key elements of their business.
Let me get through a couple of other questions here to you. So I'm pleased to also on your reference here on efforts to hire a chief risk officer to oversee cybersecurity efforts at the SEC. Now, over at the State Department, I've led the effort through the Bipartisan Cyber Diplomacy Act to establish a high-level ambassador there for cyberspace to help counter foreign threats to the Internet. My question is fairly straightforward here. Do you need our help to get this done in terms of your ambition here of filling that slot? Or can you do this on your own? Do we need any legislative language? And also, as a follow-on, how will you define the responsibilities of this new CRO that you'll bring on board?
So, trying to take them in order, I think a CRO, as we've seen in the private marketplace, we're not a corporation, but in terms of just it's good organizational hygiene to have somebody who looks across the organization at the risk profile of the organization. We have a lot of different divisions at the commission, and I can't expect somebody in one division to be constantly thinking about risks in another, but I should have somebody who's thinking about risks across those divisions. So that is the role, and the risk that kind of goes across the divisions, at least across several of them, that's most acute at the moment is cyber risk and our use of data. Do I need your help at this point? No, but if I need help, I'm not going to be afraid to ask for it.
Okay, and then I'd like to follow up on Mr. Duffy's comment on proxy advisory firms. I understand your comment that the firms do provide a service that has value, but I'd like you to look at this another way. Wouldn't you agree that the value of the information would benefit from competition in the market? Because right now, I just asked, are investors being best served when only two firms dominate that entire market? Is there more we can do to increase competition?
It is a valid point. It is a valid point. I mean, it's an interesting organizational dynamic question because somebody has to compile the data, but once one or two people do it, how do you foster competition across more of them?
Maybe we can continue that dialogue. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
That dialogue. Yeah.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Ellison.
Welcome to the committee, Mr. Clayton. You know, I'm going to kind of pick up on where Chairman Royce left off. This issue of market concentration has been on my mind a lot. And I'm glad that you're focused on this question of IPOs and startups, and I think this is an important question, but I'd like to get your take on how increasing market concentration has impacted a whole range of things in our economy. If you look up on the screen, you look at Facebook, you can see they acquired 50 companies since 2005, Google 200, Amazon 65, Apple 80. That's just in the tech area. We could get charts up there in beer, in chicken, in you name it. We pretty much can do it in pharmacies. And I wonder, like, if I am a startup person, I've opened up a new business, I'm trying to consider either taking my company public or, why wouldn't I just sell to a big company like that? Because then I could avoid a lot of fees and stuff like that and maybe get more money. And I'm curious to know, from your standpoint, is that part of the explanation for why we don't have the IPOs? And then in addition, does that explain why you see what I consider to be recklessness and a lack of care in companies like Wells Fargo? That they just don't have to be as careful because they just don't have the competition. Maybe even Equifax would be a little bit more careful if they just didn't have two other competitors in the market to worry about. They might put more energy resources into protecting our data. I mean, what are some of your thoughts on how market concentration is impacting our economy?
So, first question on, and with your data here?
Yeah.
I agree with you that, as I've said, the lack of companies going public troubles me because I want broader participation. I agree with you that not me, but when someone's sitting there saying, hey, am I going to go public? Am I going to continue to take private money, or am I going to sell? The path of least resistance and maximum return can be to sell. And that's, and that is more true in some industries than others, but it does lead to, these companies not raising money in the capital markets and a concentration. And look, it is smart for these companies to acquire smaller companies. They acquire talent. I mean, there are a lot of market forces that affect there, but I think your point is a valid one as to one of the factors driving a reduction in the number of small and medium-sized startup opportunities for people to invest in. As far as your broader question on concentration of let's just call it power in the marketplace, and does it have effects? That's outside of our bailiwick as securities regulators, but it's certainly a valid question.
Yeah, and we often don't get the chance to talk to the agency lead who would be exactly on point, but I do think the SEC has a role to play in terms of fostering competition. I mean, and keeping with what Mr. Royce just asked you, I mean, what are your views on how the SEC can help foster a greater amount of competition in the market when you look at, like, all these industries? They got 3 players in them, 2 players, 4 players. I can go on and on.
I'll give you the cliche that I use, but I think it's not just cliche. I say when we have one-size-fits-all regulation, we end up with just one size.
Well, good point. I mean, I don't know if I agree with that point, but I'll say this. We stopped doing aggressive antitrust enforcement in the 80s. And we used to be really into it, Republicans and Democrats. Now we've just said, I mean, one of the things I read about in your bio was that you used to do mergers and acquisitions. Perhaps you might be the best qualified among a lot of other people to really say, now that you're on the other side of the divide, we might want to start taking this problem a lot more seriously about declining competition.
Well, an area that I can step into and say that I'm worried about declining competition is in the provision of financial services. I don't want to see our regulations drive us toward a limited number of players in financial service provision.
Well, I agree with that, and that's why I think that we've had a lot of debate in this committee over a SIFI designation. My thought, if you don't want to be a SIFI, get smaller. Anyway, I hope that we can continue this conversation. I am worried about you mentioned risk. When you are so big you don't have to worry about risk, then you tend not to. Anyway, I'm out of time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Holtgren.
Thank you, Chairman. Chair Clayton, thank you for being here. Good to have you here and appreciate your important work at the SEC. I'm interested initially in discussing and getting your opinion on the implementation of the consolidated audit trail in light of recent discovered breaches in the Edgar database at the SEC. 2 days ago, in an op-ed by Hal Scott and John Gulliver of Harvard Law School, ran in the Wall Street Journal, made a number of points for why the proposed data collection went far beyond its intention for unraveling market events, such as the flash crash. Specifically, they note, and I'll quote from their op-ed, an SEC cost-benefit analysis for the CAT did not meaningfully weigh the risk and potential cost of a cybersecurity breach against the benefit from the improved ability to discover the cause of a flash crash or identify a market manipulator, end quote. I wonder first, do you believe the operators of the CAT thesis is taking the appropriate steps to secure the information that will be stored within the CAT? And what role does SEC have in overseeing this?
Okay, so Professor Scott's editorial, I think it's fair to quote from it because I think it was no one likes criticism, but it was a fairly based set of questions that we should be asking ourselves. And to your specific question about oversight of security, the first line of oversight of security is with the SROs, who, under our plan, are charged with overseeing Thesis, the vendor who's producing the CAT. And I do intend to press them on whether the current security procedures that are in place are appropriate, and to do it in the kind of detail that Professor Scott raised in his editorial, which was, okay, what is the data you're taking in, and is the security apparatus appropriate for that data?
That's our hope, that this is obviously vital information that's there and potentially susceptible, and so we're just concerned about that. I also am concerned about some of the timing. NMS plan for the CAT calls for specs to be produced by May of 2018, detailing how personal identifiable information should be shared and protected. However, the SROs, as we were talking about, are scheduled to report data beginning November 15th, which is just 5 weeks from now, hard to believe. How can we expect Thesis to construct a test a secure database within such a short period of time? And then wouldn't it be more appropriate for the SEC and the NMS plan to consider PII before this information is collected and shared by the SEC and SROs?
Yes, and in that question of, do we have the right security in light of the data and its usefulness to us, we should be particularly focused on PII and what is its value? Are we able to, and if, does it have enough value that we should be taking it? And if it does, to what extent and what security are we going to place on it? Those are all questions that the SROs should be asking Thesis, and I should be looking at from an oversight perspective, and then if we eventually take that data in, we should be looking at.
Yeah, my sense is that your voice is very important in this, of clarifying what really is necessary and what isn't necessary for the SROs to collect, and especially, and I think that gets back to this cost-benefit analysis of absolutely, we want to do everything we can to identify bad actors or problems in the market, but at the same time, we realize this information really is personal and important, and we want to protect it. So again, that's the point of my question. Let me move on because I've just got a minute left. I sent you a letter earlier this year regarding amendments to FINRA Rule 4210. I want to thank you for your quick response and for the attention your agency and FINRA have given to the issue for small and middle market dealers that my letter highlighted. I'd also like to commend you on your initiative to assemble a fixed income advisory committee at the SEC. To my prior point, I believe it would be helpful to make sure that small and middle market dealers have a strong voice before the commission. These dealers are often overlooked, unfortunately, with policymakers and as new rules come up with and new regulations and things. And I think it's a great opportunity to help prevent that. So I wanted just to see, can you give the committee a sense of when the advisory committee will officially begin its work, and what are the primary topics for which you hope that they can lend expertise to the commission? And again, any thoughts you have on having smaller or middle market dealers have a voice in that?
So on the committee itself, as soon as possible, I'm working through this with Commissioner Piwar and Commissioner Stein. We're doing it in a very collaborative way with respect to representation on the committee. To your narrow question, yes, this is not going to be all the big boys.
Good.
It's going to have.
That's important. I've got a lot more questions. We'll follow up in writing if that's okay. Thanks, Chairman. I yield back.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Cleaver, ranking member of the Housing and Insurance Subcommittee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for being here. Presently, security laws will allow good acting companies that follow the law to receive less oversight and more relaxed disclosure requirements. And on the other hand, current security laws would say that if you are found guilty of felonies or even misdemeanors, or if your company just stepped on anti-fraud provisions, that based on those laws, you're supposed to be automatically disqualified. I'm assuming you do understand that that's not how it works, because we have repeat offenders, who don't suffer when they violate these security laws. I can call the names of some of the companies. I'm not anxious to do that, but I will if you wanted me to do so. Do you have any, assuming that I'm correct in my assessment, which I am, what would you do to deter that kind of behavior? Essentially forgiving the bad behavior and allowing companies that are repeatedly violating securities laws to function like they're a moral company.
So this is the area of bars, and whether it's bars from the industry altogether or bars from particular activities. And I break it. I'll just tell you how I look at it. I break it down into two areas. One is individuals. Having given us, the Securities Exchange Commission, the power to bar individuals, I think is very important. And I expect our enforcement division to use that power aggressively, because if you have individuals, it's a privilege to work in this industry. You do well if you work in this industry, and if you're an individual bad actor, you should be out of the industry. And I think I've made that clear to our enforcement division.
Well, are you?
And then there are companies.
Yes.
Companies are more complicated, because you can have a relatively junior person in terms of the hierarchy who is a bad actor who you're getting rid of. And I do have a hard time making shareholders pay substantially for that type of activity. Now, but to be clear, if you have activity at the top of the house that is, bad activity, or there's endemic activity, I do believe in bars. And so I'm just giving you a flavor. That's how I look at it. Different people can look at it different way, but that's how. And I also I want to empower the enforcement division with the power to pursue those bars, because it makes them more effective.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Sometimes these repeat offenders are not dealt with, in my estimation. In fact, I think about this a lot. You rob a neighborhood convenience store, and you are going to be ostracized and criminalized. You rob America, and you are decriminalized and monetized. And, it's just one of those things, that in the middle of the night I get a headache. And the years that I've been on this committee, 13 years, we've had people come in here who've done some bad stuff, and they get punished with a $60 million separation amount of money. I mean, you know, that's their punishment. And you know, the world, the people out in the world, you know, see this and they don't understand. It makes people angry. It's one of the things that I think angers. I wish we had more time, but the time is out. You do understand, I think, where I'm going.
I do, and I want you to know we formed a new unit in our enforcement division, a retail fraud unit that is focused on this, and one of the things they're very focused on is recidivists. So we're, you know, we need these people out of the, we need those people out of the industry.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The chair wishes to inform all members that after calling on one more member, the chair will call a short 10-minute recess. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Ross.
Thank you, Chair. And Chairman, thank you for being here as well. And thank you for not increasing your budget request this year. That's rather refreshing to see that more can be done with less and really challenge the efficiencies of the skills and resources that are under your tutelage there at the SEC. One of the things I've been concerned about for a long time, and you spoke about this a little bit, capital formation, and specifically the ability of smaller companies to access benefits from the capital markets. Compared to larger capitalization ranges, small cap equities face unique challenges in both capturing the attention of analysts and attracting institutional investors. As a result, many potentially high-growth companies often face a deficit in independent investment research and a lack of liquidity after going public. Again, you discussed the one-size-fits-all. Some CEOs have branded this phenomenon as the valley of death. Unfortunately, it's becoming clear that this issue is causing many promising companies, our startups, the one that you spoke about that aren't happening, to stay private longer or elect to sell to larger companies, rather than accessing the capital markets to foster job creation. Are there any steps the SEC can take to help reduce the barriers faced by small cap equities after they go public?
I hope the answer is yes. One of the motivators of the tick size pilot that we've been looking at is if we adjust the tick size, are we going to get, you know, how do I say, better trading, you know, increased liquidity, and perhaps attract more research? If you do those things, it makes it more attractive to become a medium-sized public company to start with. That's one of the questions we're asking ourselves with the tick size pilot. There are other things that I'm thinking
and I guess where I'm going with this is that our European friends have a different approach to this, and specifically with MiFID, the Markets and Financial Instruments Directive 2, that will, of course, require that they unbundle their research and have to. I mean, it's going to adversely impact the consensus values. It's going to adversely impact earnings. It's going to impact a lot in the markets. In fact, devaluing domestically. Are there measures that the SEC is taking to address this?
Yeah, there are a lot of commentators who believe that the unbundling is going to have an adverse impact at the small and medium-sized.
They can't afford it. I mean, they're going to eventually have to register as an investment advisor, and it's going to hurt. It's going to trickle down to Mr. and Mrs. 401k.
This is exactly why I don't want that model to be imported.
Right, but it's going into effect in January, and I guess
it's going into effect in Europe in January, right. And I want our approach to their efforts to ensure that the U.S. markets don't have to import that model.
And what can we do to help in that regard?
And there's a patchwork that we're putting together of exemptive relief. But we can't do this alone. We have to have our European colleagues recognize that we will recognize the way they're approaching the market, but recognize the way we're approaching the market should stay the same way. Because that capital flows back and forth.
Right.
So we can't just draw a line down the middle of the Atlantic and say, you do it your way, we'll do it ours. We have to
some
cooperate.
Transition, yes. Yeah. Asset managers, you know, they're totally different than the bank entities, yet they are being identified by FSOC as potentially being SIFIs, and yet they're under the authority of the SEC. It would seem to me that there are obvious differences. I mean, there's a difference in risk, there's a difference in capital. Would you not agree that the SEC is more than competent to regulate the asset managers as it has been doing without FSOC's interference as SIFIs?
I agree that this is our space.
And even being your space, I would hope also that if any asset managers were of such a significantly important financial institution, that you would allow them the opportunity to be recognized early on, to have an opportunity to correct that, and to stay in the market without having to adversely impact the markets because they were taken by surprise not knowing what their classification is.
I think that's a reasonable perspective on this issue.
I appreciate that. And Chairman, I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The committee now stands in recess for 10 minutes. The committee will come to order. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Perlmutter.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Commissioner, thank you for being here. I just have a couple questions and sort of basic stuff. I first want to start with these ICOs, these initial coin offering things. It reminds me of the old days with penny stocks. And I mean, it can be different medium every time. And I just, you know, you're in a position where you got to balance formation and ease of liquidity with the potential for fraud and theft and loss. So just kind of your basic philosophy on this stuff now that you're chair of the commission.
So I agree with you. This is, here we have a new thing that has some good, but it's a new avenue for fraud. And that was getting the 21A report out, saying, hey, here's the good way to do it, here's the bad way to do it. That's sort of the guidance for, you know, people in the marketplace. But then we have the bad actors, and I'm cautiously optimistic about the enforcement division's approach to this. They know that this is a ripe area for pump and dump.
Right.
Right? I mean, you know, pump and dump, it's actually even easier here than it is in the, you know, the penny stock area, because, you know, it's all electronic, it's all anonymous, it's harder to catch the bad guys at the end of the day. And, you know, I recognize that, and from a philosophical and policy point of view, if we're not doing a decent job on educating people that that's what can happen, and then when the bad guys act, getting at them, it's going to be a lot harder for us to get the benefits of this kind of technological advancement. So that's how I look at it.
Okay, and I agree with you. So, I mean, you're going to just always have it be balancing this sort of stuff. So, I serve on the new subcommittee that we formed on terrorism and illicit finance, where, you know, a lot of our concerns deal with cryptocurrencies and electronic, you know, kinds of transactions, but more, you know, financing of bad guys. But potential, the SEC is going to have to keep their eyes on all of this. The second question I have is sort of going to an Equifax or a Sony or a Yahoo or Edgar or whatever. A hack occurs, but let's put it in the private sector. And you talked about materiality, a reportable event. Given you potentially have insider trading and you potentially have bad guy trading.
Mm-hmm.
So how quickly do you expect somebody to report this kind of hack upon their discovery of it?
I've done this for a while in terms of disclosure. You can't put a specific day time frame on this, but what we can ask people to do is to constantly assess, am I at the point where I know that this is something that investors making investment decisions should know, and what can I tell them? And it's not an easy thing to do, but my experience is the sooner you can reach a conclusion on that and get it out, the better. And you can see with our own work here, you don't always know all the facts that you'd want to know at the time you have to make the disclosure, but erring on the side of earlier rather than later is the way to go.
Right, and I would just, you know, suggest to you, you're moving from the attorney who has had to deal with and advise clients to the regulator who says, you should have done this earlier. And, or you didn't have enough information, we're going to cut you some slack. But it's a different mindset.
Absolutely.
That you got to have.
Yep. No, and I've been pretty clear, going back to before we had the incident we've discussed in July, that I would like to see better and more prompt disclosure. I thought it was good to get that message out.
Okay. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Pittenger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for hosting this important briefing. And thank you, Chairman Clayton, for being with us today and providing us your perspective on so many important issues relative to the SEC. My interest today, Chairman Clayton, is to address the pending sale of the Chicago Stock Exchange to a Chinese government-affiliated firm. And I would thank you for your recent thoughtful decision to freeze this transaction. As you are aware, for the past year and a half, I've led a congressional effort to block this transaction over our significant national security concerns. In addition to national security, we're also concerned that the SEC may have trouble monitoring the post-transaction ownership of the exchange with a Chinese foothold in this market, and that there might be significant Chinese government dominance over its business operations and decision-making, enabling a company to be listed that would not otherwise previously been acceptable. With this in mind, would you please describe the actions and thought process that led to the Commission placing a hold on this transaction?
I'm happy to discuss the procedural aspects of where we stand. And where we stand is Commissioner Stein, Commissioner Pilar, and I will have to decide this issue because it is now before the Commission.
Yes,
so I'm not going to comment on the merits in light of that deliberative process. But from a process point of view, this was a matter that had originally been delegated to the staff. We delegate lots of matters to the staff.
Sure.
Staff went through its review process, produced a recommendation. That recommendation is now being reviewed by the Commission. We've provided a time period for additional submissions of information. Those submissions of information are coming in, and it is a group effort with my other commissioners. I feel like we're working collaboratively very well in all areas. I expect we'll work well in this area, but speaking for myself, I want to bring this matter to a resolution sooner rather than later.
Yes, sir. Do you have a time frame for an adjudicatory decision?
I don't have a specific time frame, but I don't expect this to be, I don't expect to be talking about this particular aspect of it next time I see you.
Thank you, sir. As you know, the transaction did receive the CFIUS approval under the previous administration. In light of your decision to freeze the transaction, would you qualify this at this point as a national security oversight by CFIUS in the previous administration?
You know, there are a lot of ground that I have to cover.
Sure.
National security is not really one that they have given me responsibility for.
Well, there are bases.
I need to take advice on national security.
Yes, sir, I understand that. Let's move on then. Earlier this year, Acting Chairman Pilar stated it's difficult to conceive of a circumstance that would counsel in favor of enforcing the due diligence requirements of the conflict mineral rule. Do you agree with Acting Chairman Pilar's reviews, and what is the status of the SEC work on modifying the conflict minerals disclosure rule?
So, just taking a step back on the conflict minerals rule, this was the subject of substantial court process involving the First Amendment, a finding that parts of the rule did in fact violate the First Amendment. The district court has now sent all of that effectively, I'm using layman's terms rather than lawyers' terms, has sent that back to the Commission to assess whether where we stand today, which is the rule is partially in effect, is appropriate in light of that decision. And one of the questions is our current no action stance on the due diligence appropriate? And we're looking at it.
Mm-hmm. Yes, sir, thank you for that. Just going back briefly to the Chicago Stock Exchange issue, do you consider the Chinese foothold in our markets and being able to list a semiconductor company, perhaps, or some other business that would not otherwise, we would not have accepted? Do you believe that that is a concern?
Look, I don't want to talk about specific instances because that's not appropriate. But what I can say is the United States has generally been in favor of fair and open global capital markets.
Yes, sir.
I think we've
agree
led
with
the way that. But it's fair and open. And one of the things I have to do in my job is assess whether we have fairness across jurisdictions.
Okay, I understand. Thank you.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Lynch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank the witness. Welcome, Mr. Clayton. I'd like to revisit the issue of the Equifax hack and breach and possible insider trading. And I think to talk about this, the timeline is important, and that is that on or about July 29th of this year, 2017, Equifax discovered that their computer systems had been hacked and that the Social Security numbers and personal identifiable information for about 143 Americans was stolen, including their Social Security numbers. Sometime later, but before the hack had become public information, the 3 top executives for Equifax sold about $2 million worth of stock. And because they were clever enough to conduct this trade before the information was made public, and while it was inside information, they avoided a 35% drop in the share price. Now, I understand that you were asked some questions about this over in the Senate. And you were asked if there was an investigation of these 3 individuals and the trades that they had made before the news of the hack and of the breach had been made public. And you were reluctant to answer that question. Could you answer that today?
I would provide the same answer to you that I did in the Senate and that I do with anything with respect to the matter. We at the Commission have a longstanding policy of not commenting on whether we have an investigation ongoing or any details of an investigation.
Let me ask you this. It
has served us well. I'm sorry.
When we had the Edgar situation, you came right out.
That was us.
Yeah, it was you.
Yep, and I made an exception for that because I thought it was important, and it's ours.
The only thing, look, so this is 143 Americans. This is everybody.
Mm-hmm.
This is everybody.
What I can say, and we are mindful of the significance of cybersecurity issues. We're mindful of the significance of insider trading, and we're very mindful that the American people, they want to know that we're doing what they would want us to.
I want to know that too.
Yeah.
I'm on this committee.
Yep.
I got to tell you, and I'll follow up on Mr. Cleaver's questions.
Mm-hmm.
So we have bad actor restrictions,
Mm-hmm.
and your commission regularly and customarily is giving exemptions and waivers to people who repeatedly violate the law. So that's why it makes me ask the question, are you investigating the 3 executives from Equifax? If I didn't have doubt, I wouldn't ask this question.
Yeah. I am confident. Let me answer your question in a general way that I hope gives you comfort, and that is that if we were to find that an executive of a U.S. public company committed insider trading, I am certain that we would ban them.
Well, they're saying they did. Equifax is saying that they were hacked on the 29th and that sometime before they announced it to the public and the stock went down 35%, they're saying they sold $2 million. Mm-hmm. So the elements are there.
Mm-hmm. I want to go back to Congresswoman Maloney's question about having a control in place so that issues like this are avoided in the future, and that is if a company determines that it has a material event that it should disclose, I do believe it is good corporate hygiene for Section 16 insiders, set of executives, to not be permitted to trade by their insider trading policy. I do believe that.
Well, I'll let that go for now. I'll wait for further action. But in the meantime, I do want to just amplify what Mr. Cleaver was getting at. When these folks are repeatedly found to have violated the law, it doesn't help our confidence in the SEC to have you regularly and routinely give them waivers from the bad actor legislation that we in Congress have passed. I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Rothfuss, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman, I want to talk a little bit about the issue with the capital markets we have and the liquidity of them and depth. Your testimony, you state U.S. capital markets have long been the deepest, most dynamic, and most liquid in the world. Yeah, I'm wondering about the connection between depth and liquidity, particularly when we consider the decreasing number of public companies and fewer IPOs that we've been seeing. It was interesting. Representative Ellison showed a chart looking at delistings of public companies going back into the 70s and how the line went up and down with respect to mergers and acquisitions. The mergers and acquisitions have been around a long time, and delistings happen as a result of that. But what's new here is the lack of new companies coming in. We've seen a similar dynamic going on in the community bank space with all the consolidations going on and very few charters coming on. I think the SEC has said it costs $2.5 million to go public and ongoing costs of $1.5 million for public companies. And you've talked about how fewer public companies are affecting Mr. and Mrs. 401k. Do fewer public companies mean a shallower market?
Well, do they mean a shallower? Do they mean that the portfolio you can choose from is smaller?
Yeah, so if you have, say you used to have 5,000 public companies, now there's 2,500. Fewer options for diversifying, concentration.
Yes. And now people are starting to look at this, academics, market participants. They're starting to look at, if you have a shrinking number of companies and you have continuing need for investing, investing for your retirement, investing, is that somehow having an effect on the marketplace that we should be concerned about? Now that's sort of an
Well, it seems it might also have an effect on liquidity too.
It does. It does.
Anytime you shrink the number of purchasers or the number of sellers, I think it's going to impact on liquidity. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I outlined in my 4 priorities cybersecurity. One of them was, market integrity, including structure and risk. And this is one of the things that I think I need to better understand, and we need to better understand, is how are our markets changing, and is it having an effect on liquidity?
The chairman started off the question about the fewer IPOs. I think you responded, one of the problems has been one-size-fits-all regulations, and you spoke favorably of scalability. You also mentioned the funding options that weren't there decades ago that are now there as options. I wonder if it would be a benefit for the SEC to take a look at some of the regulations we've had over the 20 years. In a July 12 speech, you said the Commission should review its rules retrospectively. We should listen to investors and others about where rules are or are not functioning as intended. We cannot be shy about being introspective and self-critical. Can you explain how you plan for the SEC to retrospectively review regulations it promulgates as well as regulations that are already on the books to ensure that they are still effective? I mean, take a look at the SAR box, take a look at the capital formation provisions within Dodd-Frank and ask, are the costs outweighing the benefits for what these were intended? Can you shed a little light on that?
Well, I think the FAST Act and what you will see from our proposal is that kind of thinking. Are there ways to make it hopefully much less expensive or burdensome to provide material information without in any way diminishing investor protection? And yes, we should be looking across the spectrum of our rules. And what I said in that speech is the effects our rules have, because sometimes we make a rule and we think it's going to cost X to implement it, and lo and behold, it's 3X.
Right.
And those are the particular circumstances where we should be looking, because we made some assumptions. We did it in a reasonable way, but Turns out, looking forward, it costs more money, and we need to think about that. I mean, the numbers you cited on the costs of IPOs, to be perfectly honest, I think they're light.
The FASB issued their final current expected credit loss, or CECL standard rule, in June 2016. This rule would change longstanding accounting rules by requiring financial institutions to reserve for the expected life of loan credit loss when the loan is first issued. Do you plan for the SEC to conduct its own review of this rule with you as chairman?
So I understand some of the concerns, particularly from what I'll say is our regional and community banks around the CECL rule and the potential impact on capital. I know that they're talking to the banking regulators about that, but I'm mindful of keeping an eye on where the practical results of this accounting change go.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman, for 5 minutes.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman. First, a couple of accounting issues. I find that those are scintillating and draw much more attention to the committee and its video. First, for over 100 years, accountants have defined and audited income and expense. But investors care about other numbers, same-store sales, backlog. And I hope that you would lead the SEC in moving toward a situation where either your designee, the Financial Accounting Standards Board, or the SEC itself defines the terms that are important to investors in various industries and requires that they be audited. Right now, I'm investing based on same-store sales, but Nordstrom has one definition, Target has another, and I don't trust either's numbers because neither one is audited. Research and development by private companies is what we expect to lead the 21st century. We in Congress spend tens of billions of dollars to encourage it. The FASB, using the power you've given them, requires the immediate write-off of all research, even successful. That is a contradiction of accounting theory, but it's easier for accountants. They've done it that way for 30 years. They did it the other way for 150 years. And I would hope that you would take a look at the extreme harm done to our economy and look at all the research that isn't being done and the inventions that are not being developed because of that unwarranted departure from accounting theory. As we were talking about bond rating agencies, as long as the bond rating agency gets selected by the issuer, we are going to have a situation where they're willing to give AAA to Alt-A, which is exactly what caused the meltdown. An asset manager, a bond manager who fails to buy AA and AAA rated securities just because they're a bunch of liars' loans or subprime mortgages will find that that person is replaced by someone who is willing to go for the high rating. We've talked here about cybersecurity, and Mr. Davidson from Ohio and I are working on a bill to direct both the SEC and FINRA to develop and implement risk controls to safeguard market data, and to direct the CAT contractor to develop risk controls to protect CAT data, that's the Consolidated Audit Troll, and to prevent that operator from accepting data until it develops the risk controls. And I hope for the record that you would respond to those concepts. I now want to shift toward an interesting issue, and that's Rule 30E3. The only folks really in financial services industry that can't provide information electronically are the mutual funds. And the amount of wasted paper is so great that the pulp and paper manufacturers are lobbying against the efforts. On behalf of over 2 million trees a year, I would hope that you would move forward. This rule was first introduced in 2015. It'll allow mutual fund companies to send annual reports to investors electronically. Of course, investors would still have the option of receiving paper statements. And I want to point out how much more useful the electronic statement is. I get these paper statements. I put them under something, and then the magazines pile on top. I can never find them if, God forbid, I ever wanted to look at them. And since I may not be able to understand them, and I want to send them to somebody who does understand them, but I never find them, I never put it in an envelope, and I never mail it anywhere. If you send it electronically, then all I have to do is look under, search my email for emails from info@vanguard.com. I can have it anytime I want it and forward it to anybody I want. So electronic is better. It'll save investors $2 billion over 10 years. And I wonder if you could let us know when we can expect this 2015 project to be completed. If you could answer that one for the UFO.
I got them all. I'll go. Should I go with that one?
Go with that one.
We are working on the rule. You make a number of valid points. There are some valid points in terms of people who want paper, but we're not just putting this in the drawer. We're gonna look at it.
2015.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Chairman, for being here today. And I'm a small business owner, 45 years in Texas. We share some friends, and it's good to have you here today. And I don't have to tell you, and we've talked about how burdensome regulations have just been hampering small business creation and to stay in business, and I appreciate your involvement in that. Let me go to Dodd-Frank. The SEC past years has improperly utilized its resources, attempting to create overbearing rulemakings which do not advance the SEC's statutory goals, nor do they help avoid other financial crises. So in the light of the previous administration's improper use of SEC resources, what steps have you taken since you were sworn in May to focus SEC resources on the stated goal of protecting investors, maintaining fair, orderly, and efficient markets, and facilitating capital formation?
So to go to specific steps taken, let me talk about the things that, in looking at what we do, I've said, you know what, there's an area where we need to either do better or focus, and we spent a lot of time talking about cybersecurity. I've talked a little bit about, I want to go back to it, retail fraud. That's an area that I am surprised and dismayed at how much retail, just affinity fraud, and that's an area where I think that's an area where we make an impact when we devote more resources, not only in terms of finding it, punishing the people who are committing it, but thinking creatively about ways we can structure what we do to make it harder to commit a fraud, particularly ones that affect our retail investors. In terms of efficiency and capital formation, we looked across the spectrum and said, what can we do quickly that's not going to impact investor protection, that's going to make a difference? Confidential filings, eliminating the requirement for financial statements that are extraneous. We've done a number of things like that, and I think they're making a difference. More generally, I am focused on scaling our approach to across the capital markets and across capital formation to reflect the size and type of investment that people are making. We have that going on. We have it going on in a kind of patchwork way, and I want to bring a little more systemization to that'll hopefully foster capital formation. So those are some thoughts.
Good, thank you. I noticed in your budget request you asked for an additional $245 million to assist in the procurement of a headquarters lease. What steps are you taking to ensure the taxpayer funds used for any relocation are properly used for that?
So we are having the GSA run this process effectively. I mean, that's what's happening. And their process is a procurement process that has bidding procedures and competition. And the reason for the 245 is to enable us to effectively set up a competitive process. So let me put it in business terms. We need that money so that one party doesn't think we're a captive and that we can have a competitive process across a bunch of different headquarters locations. That's why we need it.
Good. What's the commission doing to lower the monetary burdens? We've talked a little bit about that associated with going public. And how can we encourage more businesses to go public? And as you've talked about, one size doesn't fit all. We know that. So how do we encourage more people to go public?
So I think we've started with our confidential submission. People were worried about the public offering process and that they would have to very early on make public their financials, their business, et cetera. We've delayed that while still enabling them or enabling investors to have a long time with that information. You know, like I've said, I do believe the Jobs Act and saying, you know, you don't have to do 404B until you're a big enough company to warrant that. Those types of measures, we're looking at additional measures of that type to reduce the, look, an annual spend to be public of $2 million versus an annual spend of $4 million, that $2 million delta, yeah, it's not just, that's real money in terms of valuation.
Well, thank you. I yield my time back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Wisconsin, Ms. Moore, ranking member of our Monetary Policy and Trade Subcommittee.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. And before I begin my questioning, I was wondering if I could put a couple of letters in the record ask unanimous consent to put a letter in the record from the Government Finance Officers Association.
Without objection.
Okay, and also I'd like to put a letter in the record that we sent to the Honorable Walter J. Clayton II, the ranking member Maxine Waters and I, regarding Section 1502.
Without objection.
Thank you so much. Thank you for appearing, sir. It is very nice to meet you, and I hope that we'll have a very fruitful relationship. Let me just start out with asking you about a piece of legislation that Representative Rothfuss and I are planning to reintroduce regarding the money market mutual funds, where the SEC has moved it from a stable to a floating net asset value and imposed liquidity fees and redemption gates on investors of these funds. Mm-hmm. As you may know, that our municipalities and many governmental agencies invest in these money market funds, and they have to be stable to protect public funds. And changing the main feature of these funds to floating NAV has really meant that cities are forced to go to more expensive investments. And without going on and on, because you know this topic, at a time when our country needs to invest in infrastructure, it is really difficult for cities to do this, make payroll, and we're hoping that this is something you'll look at.
Yeah, thank you, and we are looking at the effects of that rulemaking.
Right. All right. Thank you so much. I was really happy to hear. I've been here a long time, so I was able to hear much of your testimony and able to hear you say very declaratively that materiality is the touchstone for investors and consumers, respectively. You were talking about cybersecurity with Mr. Royce, I believe, but I do think that has some applicability to Section 1502 of the SEC with regard to conflict minerals. As you know, the acting chair of the commission and now a commissioner, Mr. Piwar, concluded that the court's judgment in April held that he concluded that they weren't going to enforce the provisions under 1502, although the court only said that the descriptor requirement was inappropriate. And so you say that you're looking at this, and I'm hoping that you're going to be informed by your commitment that you've made here today to be very, very proactive on enforcement.
Yes. We are looking, and I am engaged with our Division of Corporation Finance and our General Counsel's office. It's not every day that we get a rule that we're told.
But I think it was a misinterpretation of that rule on Mr. Pewar's part, particularly since you said materiality. I mean, materiality is important to investors, whether they're investing in these conflict minerals, and also to consumers. We see, you know, our cell phones here. Nobody wants a cell phone that was financed by rape, murder, mutilation. Would you agree? That's material.
Yeah, the way you characterize it, I agree that I don't want that kind of cell phone as a consumer of cell phones. I want the rules on the books. It's a mandate.
Thank you.
I want to make sure that we do it in the right way.
Okay, thank you. You know, you told the Senate, I got 30 seconds left, you told the Senate on the 26th of September that Mr. Pewar's action to prevent staff, 20 senior enforcement officials, to no longer be able to issue subpoenas, you know, in the wake of the Bernie Madoff scandal was not affecting your ability to do enforcement actions. You still think that that's the case?
And I made that statement based on a detailed assessment with the heads of the Division of Enforcement. The heads of the Division of Enforcement feel that them having the subpoena power, the formal authority, it's not with me, it's with them, it's delegated to them. They feel good about where it is now. And I know them. I know that if they change their minds, they're going to tell me.
Time for indulgence, Mr. Chairman.
Time of the gentlelady has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Maine, Mr. Poliquin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. Appreciate you holding this hearing. Mr. Clayton, I'm right over here, and thank you very much for being here, sir. I know you have an affection for the great state of Maine. I appreciate that. Your kids and your wife will thank you forever if you vacation up there. This is a great time to go up there, Mr. Clayton. We need the business. Now, I wish Mr. Sherman were here, and he's a great guy, but he represents Los Angeles. Now, if you've been to Los Angeles, you know there's a lot of cement and glass and wires over there. I represent rural Maine. We have two population centers, Mr. Clayton. One we call L.A., but it's Lewiston, Auburn with 35,000 people. Then we have Bangor with 35,000 people. And in between, which is about an 8-hour drive from point to point, not Lewiston, Auburn to Bangor, but beyond that, we got moose and deer and all kinds of critters running around the roads. And we have 400 small towns, and many of those small towns, Mr. Clayton, don't have broadband. Now, the great thing about trees that Mr. Sherman's concerned about is, you know, cutting them down. Well, you cut them down, they grow back. It's one of God's great creations. We cut down those trees, sir, and we turn it into paper. In full disclosure, Mr. Clayton, in northern Maine, the northernmost part of our state, northernmost part of our country is Madawaska, Maine. We have the Twin Rivers Paper Company, the best paper makers in the world. 525 jobs, and there aren't many other opportunities up there, at least in this industry. 525 jobs, and they make a very thin, fine paper that mutual fund and other financial reports are printed on. Now, I disagree with Mr. Sherman. He's a good guy, but I disagree with him. Here's why. We have 40 million people in this country that live in rural America. 40 million. 41% of our seniors in this country, Mr. Clayton, do not have broadband access. So over in LA, California, they might be able to print out or take a look at a mutual fund report on the internet. We don't have that in many parts of Maine, and we get power outages throughout the year, not just in the winter during the ice storms. Now, your job, with all due respect, sir, and the job of the SEC is to make sure that our small investors are able to care for themselves. So if you're a grandparent or a parent and you want to take care of your kids going to college and you're saving for them, or you're a mechanic in Lewiston, Maine, and you're getting ready for your golden years and you have a nest egg, a retirement nest egg, you need to know what the heck you're investing in. I don't worry about the big guys in LA, California. I worry about the folks in rural America. By the way, Maine is also the oldest average state in the country. It is not Florida. It is not Arizona. It's Maine. My mom is 89. I love her to death. She can't use a cell phone. Having her trying to find out what her mutual fund holdings are you kidding me? So you have in front of you, sir, Rule 30E-3. And it simply says that, you know, we think it's okay that these mutual fund companies send out a letter to our seniors saying, you know, you are no longer going to get your mutual fund reports and other financial reports on paper. Now, 71% of our seniors want it on paper. Mm-hmm. And this is one of the SEC's own commission studies. All we're saying is, what if they're on vacation? What if it got lost in the snowbank? What if that notice came while they were moving or they're on vacation? That is not fair, sir, and that is not right. All I'm saying is the following. You've got all these millennials and these Gen X folks, and they understand how all this works. And over the years, more and more of rural America is going to be connected with broadband. This problem's going to go away, but it's not going away now. You have a responsibility, with all due respect, sir, not only to Maine, but to 40 million people that live in rural America, many of whom are seniors, many of whom don't have broadband connection. Please, Mr. Clayton, please withdraw this rule. It is harmful to our seniors. It's harmful to our small investors. And over time, it's going to go away. And leave it the way it is now. If you don't want your financial reports on paper, then send in the form. That's an opt-out. Don't make it so complicated that you got to do something you might not be able to do. Just let it go. So I implore you to do that in my final 41 seconds, sir. By the way, can I get a commitment from you that you'll withdraw this rule?
No, I can't make policy sitting right here.
Okay, that to me, sir, in Congress speak is you are a lean yes. Okay. And do you have any plans over the next 6 or 9 months to do anything crazy with this rule?
I don't have any plans to do anything crazy.
Well said, sir. I'm going to take that as you will take this under great advisement. You've seen all the comments when it comes to this, how important this is to the small investors that you're responsible to protect, sir. And I appreciate that very much. Sir, SEC Rule 14A8 that deals with the shareholder proposal process. Are you folks looking at that?
Yes.
You are. And do you think that it makes sense to change the ownership threshold or the holding period?
I'm taking a holistic look at it.
What does that mean?
It means the time of the gentleman from Maine has expired.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Clayton, very much.
Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Connecticut, Mr. Himes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Chairman. It's great to see you again, and I assure you this committee is not usually this much fun. It is really heartwarming for me to see somebody of your caliber and experience in the role that you're now occupying. And I want to touch on just 3 things with you this morning. First, I don't want to beat a dead horse, but I do want to add my voice to the concern that you've heard today that has been raised by any number of my constituents and organizations in my district about the risks associated with the online transmission of data to the SEC. And you've heard that a lot today, so I don't want to beat that dead horse, but I do want to add my voice to that and ask that become a real priority and that issuers come to feel confidence where I don't think they do now. Secondly, I want to touch on just 2 issues that have been important to me for a long time. And to give you a little bit of context here, I've taken more than my fair share of lumps on this committee because I really do believe that regulation is not something that should be primarily discussed as though it were religious writ, but that there is a good balance to be found and that sometimes regulation leans too heavily and sometimes it leans too light. One thing I do feel very strongly about is that there are areas in which I think there are systemic issues and possibly bad behavior. And one of those areas, it will not surprise you to know, is a project I've been working on for some time to look at the remarkable consistency of 7% gross spreads in smaller and medium-sized IPOs. This grew out of my experience with the Jobs Act, where we worked really hard to try to save new issuers money. A 7% gross spread on a $200 million IPO is $14 million. That's real money. I don't want to spend too much time on this because I do have another issue, but your predecessor, when I asked about this and I pointed to academic literature that suggested that there could be collusive behavior in this particular product, I got back a letter that was not entirely satisfying. It said that academic studies have yielded mixed conclusions about the efficiency of the market. I'm not sure that's true, and held up the Jobs Act as something that should be watched before we draw any conclusions. I looked up the data. There have been hundreds and hundreds of IPOs of the size I'm talking about since the Jobs Act came into force. Remarkably, the mean IPO gross spread was exactly 7.00%. The data is suggestive, and I'm not ready to convict, but I'm ready to suggest that there is probable cause for an investigation here. I will also add that as you have been, I have been in the room where it happened. And so I would love to see the SEC take this up in a serious way, because it's important for our issuers not only to save money, but to have confidence that market dynamics are applying. Let me give you a second to respond to that, but I do have one other question I want to raise to you.
I think it's worth looking at, and I think the way you framed it shows some thought, because it is probably if there is something that we should look at here, it's in a market segment. It's not at the top end of the market where there is negotiating power.
I agree with that. Thank you. I would appreciate that. I will follow up on that with you. Look, if the facts show that that's a competitive market, I will let this go. But I don't know of any other product or service that is so consistently priced in a purportedly competitive market. The other topic, Mr. Chairman, I wanted to raise with you. A couple of Congresses now I have submitted or dropped legislation that would clearly make insider trading a crime. You know the background here better than I do. But I'm a big believer that if we're going to convict and send people to jail for a crime, that Congress ought to establish exactly what the law is that is being violated. That, of course, is not true in the realm of insider trading. And, of course, that has led to something else that I think is suboptimal, which is decisions, particularly out of the Second Circuit, which have resulted in significant numbers of convictions being overturned. To me, that's no way to run a railroad, and I've dealt with this with your predecessor. I get that we have a long tradition of prosecutions here based largely on judicially established law. I was a little disheartened, I guess, to see your quote that you think we do a pretty good job here and you're not sure that legislation is needed. Again, I'm a big believer that if we're going to send people to jail, we ought to have a law that specifies very clearly what they are going to jail for. So I'm wondering if you're open to that notion and whether you're open to the idea that this Congress ought to actually, for the first time, be very clear in statute about what insider trading is.
Yeah. So on where we stand and what I said in that NYU, I am comfortable that we can do a good job. As far as your question about engaging on it, a concern of mine is that we will run over kind of the same facts and circumstances question in a statutory approach that we do in what I call a judge-made approach. But I'm very happy to engage on it. It's an area where I've spent a lot of time, and anytime you'd like, I'd love to talk about it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Emmer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Chairman Clayton, thank you for being here today. You might hear this from others, but in the short time that I've been in Congress, appreciate your style. This is coming before this committee and being more informational as opposed to adversarial is incredibly refreshing. Loved your comments this morning when you started, talking about the 4 things that you're concentrating on. I loved the reference to the one-size-fits-all regulatory regime and how that might be having an impact on companies going public, because it applies the same whether you're big or you're small. In your statement that we need more companies in the public market so that Main Street investors, those that are saving for retirement, those that my colleague Bruce Poliquin was so concerned about a second ago, can participate, and I added, and realize the reward of growth in America. I mean, if that's our goal, we need to achieve it. I'm going to be very simplistic in terms of concentrating on one thing. The Choice Act, actually, last year we passed something out of this committee called the Main Street Growth Act, and part of it was contemplated within the Choice Act that just passed through this committee and out of the House. It contemplated the creation of venture exchanges to improve market quality for smaller companies and their investors. I'm just wondering, is this something that you're interested in, that your SEC will be looking into?
Thank you for your comments. I appreciate it. Thanks for the comments on a larger portfolio of public companies. And sorry to take your time, but I want to be clear. I'm not interested in people being able to invest in IPOs. I mean, that's nice, it's good. I'm interested in having more companies to invest in.
Right.
But to your
choice.
Choice.
It's about choice.
Choice and a broader spectrum. To your question about venture exchanges, yes. Now, I haven't consulted with Commissioner Stein or Commissioner Pivovar about so I don't want to get ahead of them, but from my perspective, this is coming at us organically as well as from a regulatory perspective. I mean, the technology people are using for initial coin offerings is the same kind of technology that you would use to set up a venture exchange. And then the question is, what rules do you put around it so that you can have a level of investor protection that we're comfortable with, but facilitates the same type of capital formation we're seeing in kind of that small space. So that's sorry for the long-winded answer, but that's how I'm looking at it, and I think it's something we should look at.
Well, and since you have given it some thought, do you have any idea what the SEC could do to allow private entities to create a venture exchange, or is it just too premature at this point?
So,
and I'd add one.
Going back to my comment about coming at it organically, I'm sure there are a lot of smart folks who operate in the marketplace who are already thinking about this, are hearing our colloquy today, and they know what I care about. They know that I care that this works. Investors get the information they need. They can look across, the way we do private offerings today and see the kind of protection that people get. Apply that to a venture exchange, and then we have something to talk about.
Right. I mean, actually, your comment earlier today is probably it's one that doesn't require a master's degree. It's more common sense, and that is money will go to where it can realize its highest return in the most efficient manner. And I guess I listened to you today in talking about this very narrow issue, which you could start talking about a whole bunch of these issues when it comes to capital formation. I worry the government's going to make itself less than relevant because the smart people that are out there, the people that have the capital, are going to figure out how to operate if government doesn't start doing what it's supposed to do. So I guess with the little time I have left, the thinking that you've done in this area and maybe any other that would be similar, is there any additional statutory authority that the SEC needs from this committee and from Congress?
You guys have been great today because you've asked me that in a bunch of different contexts. In terms of a venture exchange, if we do, we'll be back here. If let me take you up on it, but not try to be specific today. Can I go to just one related area on that?
Which is although my time's running out.
We've talked a little bit about the cyber breach and the bad actors. Another area I'm thinking about, and it's a DOJ issue, it's a Treasury issue, it's a national security issue, is do we have the tools to get at the bad guys who are doing these cyber breaches?
Thank you very much.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Delaney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Chairman Clayton, for being here all this time. You obviously have superb credentials for the job that you now have, and we're grateful for that. You said something recently to my colleague just a couple minutes ago about how you really care about making sure investors get the information that they need. Mark Carney, the governor of the Bank of England, has spoken extensively about his view that investors aren't getting enough information about climate risk, specifically valuation variability around fossil fuel-related assets on the balance sheets of companies. Prior to coming to Congress, I started 2 companies and took them public. And I used to labor over the risk factors because I viewed that as the place that I could get in trouble. And so I guess my question to you is, do you think there's enough disclosure in this area? Because it's not so much of whether what's occurring with climate change will actually have immediate effect on the balance sheets of these companies, but it seems to me the question, almost like the mortgage market, when mortgage assets went down in value very rapidly, way before defaults went up a lot. But what happened, there was a perception that defaults would go up a lot, and then the assets went down materially in value. And that could happen with fossil fuel assets, which is, even before the effects actually hit the income statements and the balance sheets of these companies, people could say, we really have to get out of these assets, and they could fall rapidly, and it could affect the insurance industry, financial service companies, energy companies, obviously. Do you have a view as to whether we have enough disclosure in that area?
Do I have do I have a specific view on a specific company about whether we have enough disclosure in the area? It's hard for me to judge.
Not specific company, but companies in general. Do you think there's enough information in the filing statements of companies for investors to allocate capital appropriately based on?
I think you framed the question in a very fair way, and you won't like it, but I'll answer it with a question that I don't know the answer to, which is when the companies you're thinking of in your mind manage their business and they think about these potential impacts, which, as good stewards of capital, they should be, does their disclosure
reflect that?
Reflect that.
You think it does?
I don't know what's in their minds, but that's the right question.
But yeah, and I would think that somewhere in your organization, people should be figuring that out, because when you think about macro risks, this is clearly one of them. When you think of the size of the assets,
I think that applies to different businesses in different ways.
Well, it cuts across all industries, right?
And I agree with you.
Are you committed to looking at that issue?
Yes.
Okay, good.
No, that's one of the things that people say, how do you feel about regulation? Right. If disclosure, what disclosure really should do at the bottom?
This is not even about new regulation. This is about just enforcing the standard that you just described.
Exactly.
If it's material to you, it should be material to investors.
Exactly. One of the things I always ask myself in any industry is, how do they manage the business?
Right.
How do they look at that? And does the disclosure reflect how they manage the business?
That's right. And you ask a lot of companies those questions when you're in your other seat.
I did.
So two quick questions. The fiduciary rule, I know you want it synchronized, right? I agree, right answer. But do you support the rule the way it is? Do you think it's a smart rule?
It's an interesting question. It's not really clear what the rule is yet.
Yeah.
Because what a rule is how it's implemented and how you demonstrate compliance.
Right.
That's what this kind of rule is.
So are you more concerned that it's, are you more concerned about the rule, or you generally think it will get implemented well?
I like the words.
Right, okay.
No conflicts, disclose the conflicts. You owe somebody a duty, they should know what it is. The question is, are we going to implement it in a way that adversely restricts choice in terms of what type of relationship you have, or adversely restricts what type of assets you can invest in?
And the trade-off, I guess, is it could encourage a lot of innovation, right? Because as you know, people are sitting in conference rooms right now thinking of companies they can start to take advantage of the new rule, which might be good.
It might be good.
Last question real quickly. We submitted a letter to you about the Edgar filing. It was signed by 21 of my colleagues. I asked the chairman to submit this for the record.
Without objection.
I assume you'll be getting back to us about this?
I actually got it.
Good,
here.
wow.
And
the mail system still works.
Yeah. And the questions you asked are the same questions I'm asking.
So what really happened here? Was it that between when companies file their forms and they became public, was there a breach in that short period of time that people were able to capitalize on?
So as far as, take this as things aren't ongoing investigation.
Yes.
But as an example, we have a test filing system in our Edgar system. So you're going to file your earnings release.
Yep.
You test it the night before.
Yep. I remember that.
People happen to include.
And so that's where they got in. And so that's where they traded. Do you think it's big or small, the amount of money that was made on that information?
I don't know.
You don't know. Great.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Utah, Ms. Love.
Thank you so much. I know it's been a long day. I appreciate you being here. Chairman Clayton, I'd like to come back to an issue just of access to capital. The number of companies accessing the capital markets for financing or ongoing or that are going public in the recent years have been less than half the average annual number posted in the 1990s. Most alarming has been the drop-off in small companies going public. Less than 20% of initial public offerings in recent years have been valued at $50 million or less. By stark contrast, 80% of all IPOs in the United States between the years of 1991 and 1997 were valued at less than $50 million. The reason for this, the reason why this is so concerning, is that small companies account disproportionately for new job creation, according to the National Venture Capital Association. 90% of job creation by new companies occur after they go public. So My question is this. As you know, some experts have attributed the marked decline in small companies going public to the decimalization of stock prices, dropping minimum pricing increments by which stocks are traded, or the tick size from 1/16 of a dollar or 6.3 cents to 1 penny, which occurred in April of 2001. So I know that there are a variety of options regarding this issue. Last year, the SEC launched a pilot program to address this issue, or a program to restore wider tick size pricing to small capitalization stocks. I know you've been there since May, but how is that program going so far?
So the way I've talked to our economists about this, so far, the results are mixed. They believe we need to let it run a little bit longer to be comfortable that the data they're getting is actually something we can put value on.
Have you been able to draw any initial conclusions at all regarding the effectiveness of wider tick sizes to the revitalization of small cap IPOs?
Yeah, let's put it this way: the behavior in the marketplace takes a while to change. So what if what you're looking to do is drive more volume in these names, people trade more. It is mixed. There's some places where we're seeing some increased volume, some increased liquidity, and other cases where we're not. I think we need to let it run a little bit more.
Okay, so given your extensive background in this field, does the reduction in tick sizes have anything to do, in your opinion, with the drop-off in IPOs under 100 million?
I think it could be a factor. In order for a company for it to be attractive for a company to go public, you have to have demand in trading. And one of the things that bankers will tell you, I go to a banker and I say, hey, should I go public? They say, you may not be of sufficient size for the market to be interested enough in your stock for there to develop a trading market where you're going to have pricing that you're happy with.
So you don't think it's important for companies to go public earlier?
No, I do. That's a long-winded way of saying that if we can get more volume in trading in small and medium-sized companies, it will be more attractive to go public.
Is there anything that you would add to this pilot program? I mean, do you think it's sufficient enough to give you the answers that you need in the long term? I mean,
I'm hoping that program, together with the access fee pilot, will give us some information. And I have some expectation. There are people who are much more expert than I am, that the way we trade large cap stocks is not the way we should trade small cap stocks if we want to attract more capital. So the answer is I think it's going to have value, but there are a lot of factors that go into whether we're doing the right thing in the small and mid-cap market.
I think you'll agree with me that we want to have wealth-creating vehicles for the public to participate in, phenomenal growth potential of the American economy. I hope that you'll continue studying this issue because, this is what makes the world go round. This is what helps hardworking Americans be able to get there. So I hope you'll continue to work with that. We've got to work faster.
I agree with you.
Okay, thank you.
Time of the gentlelady has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Budd.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Chairman Clayton. Thank you again for being here. So you testified about some of the administrative actions the SEC has undertaken to improve capital formation. And I want to highlight specifically the SEC's decision to expand confidential IPO registration and the submission process to all issuers, large and small. So has the initial Jobs Act provision proven popular to emerging growth companies? And what have you seen since the July finalization of the SEC decision in terms of large issuers taking advantage of the SEC decision, expanding the confidential registration option?
The initial data is positive. People, not just people using it, but people saying, thank you, we intend to use it. And both from an IPO perspective, but also from the perspective of the follow-on offerings that occur in the first year. So sure. I think the response is positive, and we're also monitoring on the investor protection side. If there is any adverse views, I'd like to hear them. We haven't heard any.
So of the positive results that you've observed or seen and heard, why do you think they've been successful, or why do you think they have been positive, and have they achieved that success without compromising fundamental investor protections and transparency?
Yeah, I think this one was pretty straightforward. This made it easier, but there was no change in the disclosure, and I think investors still have plenty of time with the disclosure to make an investment decision. I haven't heard anybody say they don't have enough time.
Sure. So do you believe that the collaborative process represented by confidential registrations has meaningfully reduced the risk associated with an IPO?
I think it's reduced the risks to the company of the process, and I like the word you used. I think when companies go through the registration process and transform from a private company to a public company, they emerge as better companies.
Sure.
I think the staff review process and the accounting review
sure.
I think it makes them better companies.
Makes sense. So Chairman Clayton, I'd also like to talk about finders. Take example, if two Main Street businesses come together and one would like to raise money and they offer the other a finder's fee and that transaction works out and they actually raise capital, the SEC has held for about 16 years that this transaction required that a business needs to register as a broker-dealer. That puts them in the same category as Merrill Lynch or JP Morgan, like a securities trader. It's an unworkable strategy in my view. So is it your view that the SEC could undertake some activity towards clarifying the significant regulatory uncertainty that exists right now with regard to finders? And what would that look like in your world? So
look, this is a line drawing question, and I know that this committee has explored this issue in the terms of an M&A finder. I think the question you ask is, should we look at that if somebody's doing this on an ad hoc basis, not as a business, not in connection with a broad capital raising or a capital raising, but just...
Maybe you could answer it for both.
Yeah.
Ad hoc as well.
Yeah. I fundamentally agree that if someone is not in the business of doing this type of activity, and it's clear that they're not, and you have kind of big guys involved or, sophisticated people, sure. They don't seem like a broker-dealer to me, okay? But I don't want to go too far down the slippery slope, because when you start going out to 5 or 6 people and say, hey, how about investing in this? And by the way, I'm taking 7%.
Sure.
And, then you sound a lot like a broker to me.
Do you think that there'll be some efforts from the SEC to clarify that?
I think if somebody is worried in the situation, in the hypothetical you described, if somebody is worried that we're going to find them a broker-dealer, we probably need to address that.
Certainly. I want to raise the issue of Financial Accounting Standards Board, or the FASB Current Expected Credit Loss Standard. Mr. Zeldin from New York and I are working on a letter now, but virtually every bank in my state views that standard as unworkable. It's onerous and it's hurtful to the availability of credit. Is there a possibility that the SEC will study this rule at more length before going ahead with its implementation?
I can't make that promise today. I understand these issues. I think most of it is a bank capital issue, and whether this is going to require them to hold more capital as a result of an accounting change. I know many of these banks are in dialogue with their bank regulators about this. There is a pro-cyclicality to it, but I'll look at it.
Thank you.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The chair wishes to alert members that votes will be called on the floor soon. If remaining members would voluntarily take 4 minutes, I think we can clear all members and not have to ask our witness back after votes. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Hollingsworth, for 4 minutes.
I will take 4 minutes. Again, I want to add my welcome, especially as a UPenn alum as well, and so I appreciate you being here. Wanted to cover 3 topics. Hopefully I'll get to all 3. First, you've mentioned several times the desire to have more tailored regulation or regulatory environment for smaller businesses, and one of the things that you brought up was 404B. Certainly one of the bills that I'm looking at dropping raises the current threshold from 75 million up to a higher threshold. I wonder what your opinion about that is, and if you've come to a decision about what an appropriate threshold might be.
I have not come to a decision about an appropriate threshold, but I do think examining that threshold from time to time, like we talk about, I'm a believer in the Jobs Act.
Right.
And when something's working, let's see if we can make it work more, being cognizant of not going too far.
Absolutely.
So that's.
Well, one of the things that people in my district are very concerned about is ensuring that we have capital there for businesses at every stage in their life cycle, and certainly one of the big speed bumps is going public, and especially for smaller companies that are in need of the capital. They don't want to have these onerous requirements on them, and like you said, it makes a huge difference in valuation. So please continue to look at that. The second thing I want to talk about was the Volcker Rule, and just better understanding how the collaboration amongst different agencies that are charged with this will be carried out over the coming years. It took over 3 years to write the rule itself, and certainly as revisions come up or other changes may be necessary that can't be handled legislatively, what the process looks like for both the enforcement changes to Volcker Rule in terms of coordinating amongst the different agencies.
So maybe I'm too much of an optimist, but I'm optimistic that the Fed, OCC, the SEC, the FDIC, that we can work together on this. I said I believe in retrospective review.
Right.
This is a rule that has a lot of impact.
Yes, definitively.
So the greater the impact,
right,
probably the more important it is to take a look. I want to be clear. The policy underlying the rule that you shouldn't take depositors' money and speculate with depositors' money is a good one. The question of defining what is proprietary trading and what is not is one that is worthy of some re-examination, particularly some components of that. But,
well, I might push back against the characterization that we're taking depositors' money and speculating wildly with it, and that whether that actually transpired in a material way and whether that led to the crisis and whether the Volcker Rule really prevents that, I think are all questions, as you said, that probably need some re-examination and some thoughtful research surrounding. I wanted to delve into one other item that's a little bit more esoteric but has been perturbing me for the last couple of weeks, and thinking about the significant growth in ETFs over recent history. And look, I'm a big believer in financial innovation, but I think when you say Mr. and Mrs. 401k in wherever they may be across this country, I think when they buy or sell an ETF, they perceive that they have great liquidity, while the proliferation of ETFs have led to some more exotic strategies underlying some of the ETFs themselves. And my concern is in periods of acute stress, where money flow is reversed, instead of money flowing in, money is now flowing out in a significant way, that significant redemptions, and especially through the broker-dealers, might lead to challenges in unwinding whatever those strategies are, selling those underlying assets, and that there's a perceived mismatch between apparent liquidity at the retail investor side and actual liquidity in the underlying assets that underlie the trust. Is there any concern or look into that matter?
Yes.
Okay.
I think you articulated a risk that is not as well understood as it should be.
Great. Well, thank you. And with that, I'll yield.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Hill, for 4 minutes.
Thank the chairman. Appreciate Chairman Clayton, you coming to the committee today, and I want to echo my colleagues. We appreciate your tone and your discussion on these topics and your forbearance on all of them. I want to pick up where my friend from Mr. Hollingsworth left off on exchange-traded funds. I'm pleased that we've sent a bill to President Trump to enhance research on exchange-traded funds. This was something that the Commission itself thought about doing back in 1987, and by God, we've rushed right into it now and sent down to the President's desk a directive on writing those rules. If you have questions about it along the way, I hope you'll be in touch after that bill's enacted. But like my friend said, there have been rapid growth. In fact, some projections show that exchange-traded funds may reach $6 trillion. And you yourself, a few minutes ago, talked about the impact of passive money in the markets and price setting. For me, you have index funds, you have exchange-traded funds that are proposed on an index that's made up. In other words, someone has innovated a index, and then you have obviously fixed income versus equity. and this is really being, as Trey said, a major innovation in the markets. The Commission has really just used exemptive relief on approving ETFs. Do you think the Commission should write a rule about exchange-traded funds and approving those under certain conditions instead of just using exemptive relief as a way to tee them up?
Whether that is specifically what we should do or we should do something else, we should recognize, and this is a different context, but the same label, one size doesn't fit all. You know, like you said, an ETF that follows a broadly based or a broadly recognized index of large cap stocks is a much different animal from, you know, an inverse levered ETF that follows a specific, perhaps not all that liquid asset class. And I think we should have a, there can be a different approach to one versus the other.
Right. Well, I just would urge the Commission to look at this. We're now 15 years into this trend, and also when it comes to the pricing issue my friend raised, the impact on out in the market reg world on circuit breakers geared to individual stock performance versus a macro move in an index, and market opening times. In other words, the synchronization of individual stocks into participants in these indexes, I think, is also merits study. And something else to add to your, as Chair White referred to, the 50 front burners over at the SEC. If I could, I want to switch subjects in the minute left and talk about the definition of accredited investing. We talked about crowdfunding today. We talked about the Jobs Act. But I've put forth legislation in the past, and others are interested in the committee as well, is expanding the definition of accredited investor, which does allow people with the proper expertise to participate in the private market issue. Do you think that the definition of the accredited investor ought to be looked at and be reconsidered?
I do.
You have thoughts as to any more thoughts?
You know, what I don't like about it is the binary nature of it, which is you cross the threshold and then you can invest whatever you want. You don't cross the threshold, you have no options. Now, I'm not Pollyanna enough to think that we can, you know, have 10 different standards.
Parse that out, right? Yeah.
But it shouldn't be that binary, because if it is that binary, then we do need to constrict it.
Thanks for your time today.
Thank you.
I yield back, Mr.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Tenney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Chairman Clayton, for being here today. I'm going to echo the same sentiment that my colleague, Mr. Emmer, said, and I love your one-size-fits-all regulation leads to one size, and I think that goes beyond even your the jurisdiction of this committee and obviously the agency you chair. It's in all sectors, as I come from one of the most regulated states in the nation, New York. But I just wanted to ask you a little bit about the DOL rule quickly. I know Chairwoman Wagner touched on it, but many of my constituents, especially the 401k dependent constituents and the regular middle income level people, are really rely on the relationship with brokers. And I understand there's been a delay for about 18 months. And I just wondered about if you could just describe your relationship right now with the Department of Labor, with Chairman Acosta, and your efforts to revise and implement this rule so that it doesn't hurt our investor community and also protects seniors and others who are relying on their 401k. If you could just touch on your relationship and the delay that we are seeing right now.
So as I've said many times, I thank Secretary Acosta for reaching out on this, because it's a reality. We have to put our heads together. We at the Commission have been working on where we think this ought to go, citing the things that I outlined quickly: choice, clarity, consistency, and cooperation. We are at a point where we're ready to engage, and I look forward to engaging with the Department of Labor and Secretary Acosta's staff on this. I mean, they put a lot of thought into where they got to. We should benefit from that thought, but we need to drive toward a consistent approach to the marketplace.
Right. So as you undergo that analysis, is that something that we can have in a transparent way and work with us on this as we go forward, so we know what to expect and our investor world knows what's going to be happening?
Yeah, look, it's easy for me to say yes because the Administrative Procedures Act requires me to do that. So You know, when we're ready to pull it forward, you guys will have there'll be a lot of people taking a fair shot at this.
Thank you. I greatly appreciate it, and just thank you for your service and doing what you're doing. We're grateful to have you here for this long day, but I just wanted to say thanks again, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you so much.
Gentlelady yields back, and since she does yield back, the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Davidson, is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Chairman Clayton, thank you for being here today, and thanks for the work you're doing to uncover the facts and the truth behind what's actually been happening there at the SEC. You've answered a lot of questions about cybersecurity, so I won't belabor points that you've really already made, but I was encouraged to hear that the thoughtfulness that you're putting into what do we actually need to have. And we're moving forward on a bill, as you know, that will provide additional instructions and give some intersection between the migration to consolidated audit trail and the cybersecurity approach that you've been doing. And I guess one question is, have you given thought to layers of data so that instead of all of it being in the consolidated audit trail, all of it being in EDGAR, some of the data not necessarily being held but accessible as part of that approach?
I've given thought to it. The more important thing is that the people who know this better than I do give thought to it. But I've asked the same question that you asked, and whether that's practical. I mean, there is some data that's mission critical for the SEC, and we need to get it. But having that kind of thoughtful approach is the way I'm trying to do this.
Thank you. And then on the consolidated audit trail, net of the cybersecurity concerns, how do you feel the project's moving? Any concerns for the scope and the feasibility for consolidated audit trail?
So the consolidated audit trail, the genesis was the flash crash, and our ability to get at what was happening in the marketplace around the time of an event like that. And we learned that the data was stored in a bunch of different places, and it was hard to bring it together to do an analysis. I still want to be able to do that, and I want to be able to do that pretty quickly. That's a question I'm asking the SROs and the provider. So I think that's context to your question. I hope I got there.
It's intersecting interest. My time's expired. I yield back, Chairman.
Thank you.
Time of the gentleman has expired. I want to thank the witness for his testimony today. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the witness to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witness for his response. I would ask our witness to please respond as promptly as you are able. This hearing stands adjourned.